Committee will come to order. A quorum being present without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2, House Rule 11, Clause 2, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote is ordered. Now I'll recognize the gentlelady from Indiana to lead us in the pledge. Ms. Sparks.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank the gentlelady. Yeah, we got two flags. It's always like, I forget which one we're supposed to. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 277, the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act for purposes of a markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 277 to amend Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code to provide.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Recognize myself for an opening statement. The Constitution separates the powers of the federal government. It gives only Congress the power to make federal laws, but the administrative state violates these principles. Charged with executing the law, federal agencies have assumed the legislative power. They now impose policy through rules and guidance. Further, the administrative state has little, if any, political accountability to the people whose lives it controls. The administrative state's lack of accountability means that it can impose radical, unpopular policies that could never make it through a vote of the Congress. The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, or the REINS Act, would be a good step to help remedy these problems. The bill would require affirmative congressional approval for major rules, including those with an annual effect on the economy of at least $100 million. This helps put legislative power back in the hands of the legislature, back in the hands of those of us here in Congress. The bill is a good start toward restoring the constitutional separation of powers and increasing the accountability of policymakers to the American people. I urge support for this bill and yield back the balance of our time. And the chair now recognizes the distinguished member from New York, the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, once again, we are gathered here to mark up a bill that would frustrate the purpose of government and would put our constituents in harm's way. The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, or the REINS Act, is a huge expansion of the Congressional Review Act that requires both houses of Congress to vote and approve for the President to sign any rule from our executive branch that is in progress. The REINS Act would grind the gears of rulemaking to a halt by requiring all major rules to be affirmatively approved by both chambers of Congress. A regulation would be blocked from being implemented if even one chamber declines to pass an approval resolution. The goal of this legislation, quite simply, is to stop the regulatory process in its tracks, regardless of its impact on public health and safety. The bill purports to give Congress control of the rulemaking process, but Congress already has this power and exercises it in a number of ways. For example, Congress can delegate authority to agencies with specificity, thus limiting the scope of the agency's authority. It can impose restrictions on rulemaking through appropriations. It can also influence rulemaking through oversight activities. And if all of these measures are insufficient, we also have the blunt tool of the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress not only to overturn a rule, but also to bar the agency from ever passing a substantially similar rule. The majority has certainly not been shy about exercising its authority under the Congressional Review Act this year. The REINS Act is not only redundant, but it also creates insurmountable procedural hurdles that would stall the approval of rules of major impact, rules that would be highly beneficial to the public's health and safety. It is important to remember why we have regulations in the first place. Congress sets broad policies, but we delegate authority to executive agencies because we do not have the expertise to craft technical regulations ourselves. Who here knows how many parts per billion of arsenic should be allowed in our drinking water? Is 10 the proper amount? Should it be 5 or 15? None of us here knows the answer, but the dedicated professionals at our federal agencies, many of whom have decades of experience and vast technical expertise, undertake a careful process to protect our health and safety. This process includes numerous procedural safeguards, including public notice and comment. Regulations ensure that our air is safe to breathe, our water is safe to drink, our food is safe to eat, and the life-saving medications we depend on are safe and effective. It means that the cars we drive and the planes we fly have proper safety mechanisms. And when we do not properly regulate, sometimes it means that trains carrying dangerous chemicals can derail in our communities, putting thousands of people at risk. I feel much better about leaving regulatory decisions to the careful study of agency experts rather than to members of Congress who wanted to substitute their judgment subject to the whims of politics. Republicans have spent decades waging an all-out assault on the regulatory process, trying to add hurdle after hurdle to the ability of agencies to issue regulations that protect public health and safety. Regulations whose benefits consistently outweigh their costs, often by many multiples. If we want to improve the regulatory process, we would consider legislation such as the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which would bring more transparency and accountability to the rulemaking process. But instead, we are taking up legislation to dismantle and destroy the regulatory process, regardless of the impact on public health and safety. Mr. Chairman, one final word about process. If we were to follow regular order, we would have this markup today, and then perhaps the bill would come to the floor for consideration. But consistent with the Republicans' haphazard approach to governing, this legislation has actually already passed the House as part of the majority's reckless default on America plan. That's right, we're marking up a bill that has already passed the House. But this is not just irresponsible legislating, it is irresponsible policy. The majority plans to cut costs by cutting the very protections that ensure our health and safety. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this dangerous bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the gentleman yields back. Without objection, all of their opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes himself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277, offered by Mr. Jordan Novo.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purpose of the amendment. The chair recognizes himself to explain the amendment. This amendment permits the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act of 2023 to also be cited as the REINS Act of 2023. This change more readily allows this bill to be cited by its commonly known acronym when it is passed into law. It is not intended in any way to alter the important purpose of the legislation. I urge support for the amendment and yield back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment. Clerk will report the amendment. Gentleman from Georgia reserves a point of order.
Do they know it's the 50 million? 50 million.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277, offered by Mr.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I applaud my colleagues supporting the $100 million threshold in the REINS Act. In fact, I initially sponsored the REINS Act a number of years ago and did for several years. I think $100 million does not go nearly far enough. The administrative state has grown so big, its spending has gotten too out of control. Its regulatory authority, unchecked by Congress, has gotten too great for even a $100 million threshold to be sufficient. My Republican colleagues admit we have these two problems, the expansion of the administrative state and spending. They admit that we also have this regulatory environment, which has essentially created a fourth branch of government, as many political science scholars would attest. I suggest we reduce the threshold for congressional approval to $50 million in order to address these problems more fully and further constrain the growth of the administrative state. I know it will mean that we will have to vote more often. We will be called to approve more rulemaking proposals. I'm okay with that. That's our job. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. We should be the ones that are approving rules, that are willing to be held accountable. I want to approve rules that make America better, freer, more productive. Now's the time for Congress to regain control of agencies which we have too long negligently delegated our lawmaking authority to. When James Madison talked about tyranny, he often talked about how a legislative executive, and adjudicative authority were combined into one body. We have done that in Congress over the last 90 years and created a tyrannical, bureaucratic state. I think it's time for us to do something about it. I like the REINS Act at a $100 million threshold, but I think we should be doing more. I want the agencies to have to earn our support. I want to challenge them to write rules that fill needs, that spend taxpayer money wisely and efficiently. I want them to be constrained. I want them to think critically about their rules, and I want the president to want congressional support for substantial actions by his or her agencies. Our founder system of checks and balances demand that we rein in the administrative state and demand accountability. The smaller rules add up. I worry that we won't have a say in a litany of $99 million rules that will inevitably result from agencies attempting to circumventing the $100 million threshold. My amendment might result in more $49 million rules, but I can tell you that it's going to be a lot harder for agencies to get around that than a $100 million rule. I propose more than 500 bills to curb spending this year because we're spending far more than is authorized. There are more than 1,200 agencies, departments, and programs that are currently unauthorized that we give $500 billion to every year. I think it's time. I just got to mention this. I was criticized in the Rules Committee by the ranker because it cost $18,000 for me to introduce over 500 bills. So think about it. He was critical of a legislator for legislating. Yeah. But right here, I am hearing and suspect that my colleagues across the aisle, they're going to be absolutely okay with these bureaucratic agencies continuing to have an unchecked blank check going forward. So I would urge us to adopt my amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman on Georgia is recognized to.
I withdraw my.
Gentleman from Georgia withdraws his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I actually had a question about the point of order.
Gentleman from, I think, Maryland, but I think the point of order has been withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I don't need 5 minutes, but I did have a question about germaneness. At the last markup, we had, I don't know, maybe a dozen Democratic amendments were ruled as non-germane because they expanded the scope of the legislative proposal that was underlying it. I think this proposal here clearly increases the scope of what would be covered by this language by dropping the threshold from 100 million to 50 million. And so I raised the germaneness issue again because it seems like that it would be inconsistent with the position that the chair has taken in the previous markup. I yield.
I appreciate the gentleman. The question in the last markup was those amendments added additional issues into the legislation. This one is the same issue, just determining what the dollar amount may or may not be, depending on how the committee decides to proceed with the amendment.
If I might, Your Honor, sorry.
Your 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, it clearly expands the scope of what would be covered by this language. I don't know that the chair used the term issues when we were dealing with this last time around. I believe it was scope was the standard that the chair used in making his germaneness decision. So I would say that this is not germane under the standard that the chairman used at the previous markup with respect to the gentleman yield amendments. I would.
Just to underscore your point, by essentially potentially doubling the number of regulations that would be the subject of this, those regulations would cover all kinds of different topics, all kinds of different issues. So you're absolutely right. By changing this number, reducing it, and therefore sweeping more within the ambit of this bill, it vastly increased the scope of the legislation and is impossibly consistent with the rulings of the chair from just the last markup.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's not my time to yield, but I will yield back to the gentleman.
Yes, thank you. I think you are entirely correct. By the standards the majority used in the, what was it, the last markup, when they ruled all those amendments ungermane, this is equally ungermane. But I think we have to recognize that their rulings on germaneness at the last markup were nonsense. And they were partisan and deliberate nonsense. By any normal standard, this amendment is in order. By the standard they used at the last markup, it is not in order. But I don't see that we should hold the majority to a nonsensical standard. I yield back.
Reclaiming my time. I appreciate the ranking member's comments. I yield back to the chair.
I appreciate the ranking member telling us that this amendment's in order. I recognize the gentleman from,
Mr. Chairman?
I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me address first the argument that was just made, because I was in the chair when those decisions were made. And I just want to note the obvious here. A change in a threshold dollar amount of a bill does not equate to a change in the scope of the underlying legislation, very much unlike the amendments that were brought in our last session on the bill they're talking about. And we can go back and play the tape if you want to hear the full explanation, but I don't want to eat up all my time on that. I do want to rise in support of the gentleman's amendment for a very important reason. And I think that the American people are behind us here, and I think they would support this amendment for certain if they're paying attention and following what all this is about. Here's the simple fact, and I explain this in town halls back home all the time, and I'm sure some of you do similar things, but we have to acknowledge that the federal government is way too big, and it does way too many things, and very little of what it does it do well. The administrative state has grown exponentially over the recent decades, and it, as stated earlier, has consolidated governmental powers in the executive branch. And what that's done then is it's usurped the proper and constitutional role of Congress, our Article I authority over lawmaking and policymaking. And that consolidation of power has become really very dangerous. It's created an administrative state that is out of control. It's contrary to the separation of powers doctrine in our Constitution, our matchless Constitution, and it diminishes the political accountability of the people who set policy. If you have nameless, faceless bureaucrats who are effectively making law, they are by definition unaccountable. We literally do not know who to hold accountable. The people do not know who to hold accountable. When you have bureaucrats making all the laws, and that's effectively what's happened now, Congress allowed this to happen over a series of decades as the power was usurped. But it creates a real problem. In our system, our matchless system that everybody around the world tries to emulate, the reason it works so well is because we have separation of powers. We have checks and balances. As members of the House, we have to run for office every 2 years. Why? Because we're closest to the people. We have accountability. If we don't do our jobs well, then they'll send someone else to do it. But we can't do that with the administrative state because we don't even know who they are. And so by limiting this, lowering the threshold to 50 million is an essential thing to do. We're going to be 247 years old as a nation on July 4th. We are still a very young nation. You know, if a high school civics student looks at 247 years, they think that's an eternity, but we know that's just a small speck on the span of human history. And we don't know how long our constitutional republic is going to endure. The founders didn't know, but they said there are certain foundations that you have to maintain, and the reason that they were so insistent about the checks and balances and the separation of powers is because they understood that all men are fallen and corrupt, and that power corrupts, and as Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We are veering towards absolute corruption in the administrative state. That is why so many agencies in our weaponization select committee, why we're so busy, because so many of the agencies that were designed to protect and serve the American people have been turned against them and are being used against the very citizens they're supposed to serve. How did that happen? It's because we allowed our Article I authority to be usurped. So the REINS Act is essential. I think this threshold of 50 million is very reasonable. And I would just close by reminding us of the words of John Adams. He said, you know, explaining the difference between us and what was happening in the monarchy in Great Britain, he said, you know, we're a nation of laws, not of men. It's the rule of law that defines who we are. That's why our system works so well. And as the great evangelist Charles Spurgeon said, the best of men are but men at best. we better maintain this system of checks and balances. And I think this would be a really, really important step to prevent this death by 1,000 little cuts of our liberty and our oversight and allowing the government to grow so out of control. We wouldn't have a $31.8 trillion federal debt if Congress was more involved in these decisions. And so I'm in full support of this amendment. I think everybody should. And I think, as I said at the outset, if the American people understood and were following this argument, they would absolutely be in favor of the Biggs Amendment. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be brief. As I said in my opening statement, several things are the case. Number one, Congress has delegated over the years rulemaking authority to federal agencies because we have not the competence to judge how many parts per billion of arsenic are safe in the air or the water, and a million other things. So we have delegated that power to agencies who hire experts to deal with that. If we don't like the result, if we disagree, we have the Congressional Review Act, which can overturn the regulation. If we want to improve the process, we would consider legislation such as the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which would bring more transparency and accountability to the rulemaking process. I oppose this amendment because it makes a terrible bill even worse.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
No, not at the moment. It would make a terrible bill even worse. The bill now subjects all rules over $100 million, essentially says you can't do those rules. Now it would say for $50 million, that's even worse, and it would make it even worse for the public's health and safety, and now I'll yield.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes.
Part of the legislative process, a very critical part, and a part that we exercise here all the time, is that we rely upon the testimony of experts. I mean, that's sort of the function here. We have hearings, we bring in people of all persuasions in our areas of jurisdiction and judiciary, but we have committees of Congress that would cover every potential field. So, I mean, the question is, why should we send that authority down to people who we can't hold accountable instead of doing the job ourselves?
Reclaiming my time. We hold hearings. Those hearings are designed to result in bills that we pass and laws, but Congress cannot possibly, no matter how many hearings we hold, no matter how specifically we make the law, have the flexibility and the ability to define the various environmental and other dangers. Again, we had a train derail in East Palatine, what was it, Ohio, I think it was.
Palestine, yep.
In East Palatine, Ohio. What regulations, what degree of regulation would have prevented that? We can know in general terms. We can't know in exact terms. What percentage of lead in what was carrying should be permitted in case it got into the atmosphere? We cannot do those things. That's why we have delegated these kinds of specific decisions to agencies which have the expertise, which have a process with public comment on them, and we have given ourselves the power to overturn these regulations through the Congressional Review Act. And that's why this bill would be affirmatively harmful, and the amendment would make it even worse. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
First of all, the non-delegation doctrine is a constitutional provision indicating that the legislative branch does not have the authority to delegate our legislative authority to administrative agencies. So what the ranking member is suggesting is unconstitutional in and of itself. With that said, I'd just like to provide some very specific statistics from the 10,000 Commandments from 2022 published by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Federal spending surged to $6.822 trillion in 2021. These federal outlays are projected to reach $5.872 trillion in fiscal year 2022. The burden of regulatory regulation is equivalent to 33% of these projected federal outlays. Regulatory costs of $1.927 trillion amounts to 8% of the U.S. gross domestic product, which is estimated at $23.99 trillion for 2021. When regulatory costs are combined with federal outlays of $6.822 trillion in 2021, the federal government's share of the entire economy reached at least 36%. If it were a country, U.S. regulation would be the world's 8th largest economy, not counting the U.S., but ranking behind France and ahead of Italy. The regulatory or hidden tax associated with the regulatory burden exceeds individual income taxes by several billion dollars. If one assumed that all costs of federal regulation flowed all the way down to households, U.S. households would pay $14,684 annually on average in a hidden regulatory tax. That amounts to 17% of the average pre-tax income of $84,000. The regulatory tax exceeds every item in the household budget except housing. That means a typical American household spends more on embedded regulation costs than on health care, food, transportation, entertainment, apparel, services, or savings. Trump's total of 2,964 final rules in 2019 was the lowest count since records began being kept in the 1970s and is the only tally below 3,000. During calendar year 2021, while agencies issued 3,257 rules, Congress enacted only 143 laws. Thus, agencies issued 23 rules for every law enacted by Congress. This unconstitutionality index, which is the ratio of regulations issued by agencies to laws passed by Congress and signed by the president, highlights the entrenched delegation of lawmaking power to unelected agency officials. President Biden had the highest number of pages in the Federal Register of over 95,894 pages. In 2021, the Federal Register contained 74,532 pages of regulations. Since 1993, when the first edition of 10,000 Commandments was published, agencies have issued 114,821 final rules. Of the 95,848 final rules issued since the Congressional Review Act passed in 1996 under President Bill Clinton, there's been a revocation of just 20 rules. The Weidenbaum Center at Washington University in St. Louis and the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center in Washington, D.C. jointly estimate that agencies spent $78 billion in fiscal year 2020 just to administer and police the federal administrative apparatus. At the end of calendar year 2021, 2,094 proposed rules had been published in the Federal Register, 272 of them deemed significant, which the federal government defines as those rules having an annual economic effect of $100 million or more. The reality is that we are not being governed by the legislative branch, by the people who are accountable to the American citizens, to those who are elected pursuant to our Constitution and our laws. It is the unelected bureaucrats that are dictating the laws in this country. I support the REINS Act. I support the amendment. It is time that Congress took back its rightful constitutional authority to legislate, and we need to take it away from unelected bureaucrats who are abusing the power that this body has illegally granted to them. And with that,
Please yield to me, Ms. Hageman.
The gentlelady yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
Yeah, I just want to point out something on pages 9 and 10 of the underlying bill. It negates the argument, oh my gosh, we're not going to regulate anything. This will bring it to Congress. It doesn't mean that there are no regulations will be issued. It means that we will be the ones, and we're the ones that get held accountable, and we should be held accountable. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady yields back. The chair, who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Maryland. Oh, I'm sorry. You've already been recognized. That's right.
Mr. Chairman, I thought I was only recognized on the germaneness issue.
I'm sure we can get someone. I recognize you for 5 minutes. I'm sure we can get someone to yield.
Okay.
If you want to go now on the amendment.
Well,
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans rely on administrative agencies to ensure that our air is safe to breathe, that our water is safe to drink, and that our medications are safe. They depend on administrative agencies like the FAA to make sure that all of the rules and regulations to promote safe air travel are in full force and effect. There are so many responsibilities of federal agencies over the years. It has been the American tradition that we have experts making rules to carry out legislative intent, as evidenced by the legislation that Congress passes. Now, I've got 5 minutes to make my comments today. If this was a hearing, I'd have 5 minutes to question a witness. And you can't deal with public safety regulations in such a format as a legislative hearing. It's just simply too unwieldy an operation to be able to get at the niceties of how we're going to protect the health, safety, and welfare of Americans. And so we need federal agencies. And what we're doing today is demonizing what they call the deep state. Anybody in an agency, you're really saying that government is bad. And in fact, it's been the Republican objective for decades now. Low taxes, less government. This is really getting to what they really want, which is a society of no rules, no regulations, only the strong survive. Corporations, the rich and wealthy, get richer and wealthier. Working people, poor people trying to make it into the middle class are perennially confined to poverty. And this is what my friends on the other side of the aisle want. This is the kind of society that they want to see. And so the REINS Act is a big step forward in that direction, and that's why I oppose the REINS Act. I oppose this amendment that has been posed. America is in jeopardy of defaulting on our debt because House Republicans are holding our debt hostage. Now imagine if every administrative decision required explicit approval from Congress. Congress does not move that quickly. Agencies would lose their ability to function, and the world would become a more dangerous place. And to put into, to give you an example of how Congress operates, I mean, at the start of this Congress, it took my friends on the other side of the aisle 15 ballots to select a speaker, and selected the weakest speaker in the history of the country, now trying to negotiate a default scenario with an unwieldy conference. You just can't get it done. We would never have any action on protecting health, safety, and the welfare of Americans if we left it up to Congress. The REINS Act also may be unconstitutional because its effect is nearly indistinguishable from the one House legislative veto that the Supreme Court has already held to be unconstitutional in INS versus Chadha. So in short, the REINS Act would hurt American citizens, and so I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I'll yield to the chair, to the ranking member.
Thank you. I just want to point. Thank you. I just want to point out that we can't pass 13 appropriations bills by September. Do we really think we can carefully consider and vote on every regulation, on poison, on specific provisions to prevent airplanes from falling out of the sky? I think the question answers itself. I yield back to the gentleman. I thank him.
I yield. Yield back.
Yeah, gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last point by the ranking member, actually, I don't think it makes his point. I think it makes ours. So one reason that Congress can't do its job is because it has handed over its job to others to do. If the circumstances were different and Congress were in a position to be necessary to achieve those results, Congress would change its practices in order to get there. I can tell you that under this Republican majority, there will be in the House prompt passage of appropriations bills on all the relevant departments. And it is interesting that how fundamentally it is a sort of a political mantra of my friends on the minority side of the aisle to say that they're protecting our democracy. And I don't know if we all have the same common understanding of what they're referring to. I assume they mean the constitutional republic that exists by design. And to that point, there are a few things. The ranking member said, well, if you pass this bill, it would reduce the efficiency of passing laws. You couldn't possibly pass laws fast enough to satisfy all needs. But we don't have a monarchy. A monarchy would be one very efficient way to pass laws. The king simply decides. And there are many, if you look at executive orders, that would like to go that direction. Or you could want a technocracy. He said, right, he said, well, Congress speaks only in very broad terms. We leave the details to experts. Well, I mean, who says? One problem that we often see, if you look at the West Virginia versus EPA, is Congress speaking in broad terms often leaves ambiguity in the language. And that is often a product of insufficient deliberation and care in the design of the statute. Congress needs to do its work carefully in order to give enough guidance that people know what the law is without hordes of experts, so-called experts, filling in the gaps. By the way, that doesn't mean we can't take advantage of expertise. Congress can be advised by experts, should be advised by experts, certainly would be, is advised by experts, but the decision maker must be accountable to the people for another fundamental principle to be observed in our lawmaking, at least as by design, which is the consent of the governed. And this idea that regulations only deal with details, that was the terminology the ranking member used in his argument, is a little bit like the debate that's entered here on germaneness. Germaneness is sort of at the very margins, it's an elastic concept, but certainly we cannot say that our administrative agencies in their regulations have been limited to details. And that's what this gets at. This amendment, by the way, a lot of the debate about the amendment is not limited to the amendment, but the amendment proposes the idea that it wouldn't even take a regulation that's going to have a $100 million impact in the economy to be major, to be of significance, to require, to make appropriate Congress's attention. It should be $50 million. With that, I readily agree. But by no means in practice have our administrative agencies been limited to details. They dominate the legal landscape. And since they dominate it, ipso facto, they have displaced the predominant role that Congress is designed to have in a way that is inefficient. It is a bicameral legislature. You must pass the law twice because it is designed to prevent laws from being passed so rapidly and ill-advisedly that the people are oppressed by them. It is a feature, not a bug. And to say that we want to move away from that can by no means be reconciled with the notion of protecting our democracy. In one respect, though, I agree with comments from the minority. The gentleman from Georgia said we have a tradition. It is not our constitutional design to turn over our lawmaking authority to agencies, but it has become, I don't know if I even want to term it a tradition, but it certainly has been a practice since about 1940, and it is out of control. And it is like an 80%, 90% issue. The American people understand it and agree that it must be corrected. Sorry, I didn't save much time to yield to anybody. I will yield in the 12 seconds I've got.
That's fine. Gentleman yields back. All right. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really can't believe this bill is being offered again as a serious piece of legislation. The majority's position is that this bill is needed to ensure that Congress has more checks and balance to stop regulations promulgated by any administration, while ignoring the fact that any regulations issued by an administration must first have as their purpose to implement laws that Congress has already passed. So it's just not true. Congress has multiple legislative avenues to review and reverse regulations issued by an administration. We can hold hearings. We can offer public comment. We can disapprove major regulations before they take effect. We can rescind regulations under the Congressional Review Act, and in fact, we're considering 3 such measures this week. And we can pass legislation to change laws or regulations that we disagree with. So to say that this is some kind of noble effort to empower Congress is disingenuous, and it diverts attention from the disastrous consequences that this bill would create. Today's legislation would ultimately prevent the federal government from issuing the regulations it needs to protect and defend our nation and the American people in the modern world. Any new regulation would have to be passed by Congress in order to take effect. Think about that for a minute. In a Congress with a House majority that can barely agree on anything, including whether to keep the government open and pay the United States legal, already incurred debts, Congress would have to approve every new major regulation from every federal agency. And if that doesn't scare you, think about the fact that the Senate, hardly a model of expeditious legislation, would also have to pass every regulation. Congress struggles every day to meet the most pressing needs of the American people. As the ranking member noted, Congress hasn't managed to pass the appropriations bills that it's required to in about a decade. There are not enough hours in a day or a year or a congressional term to have Congress weighing in on every regulation needed to implement the laws that we do pass. The REINS Act would effectively nullify all new rulemaking by any president, Republican or Democrat, and it would grind government operations to a halt, which may be the real purpose here. Imagine an FDA that can't issue new drug regulations, an EPA that can't keep our drinking water clean, and a VA that isn't meeting the needs of our veterans. Imagine a Department of Transportation that can't enforce safety standards for cars or trains or, God forbid, airplanes. That's what the majority has proposed, and it's a dangerous vision for America. But since the chair has already offered an amendment to the title of this bill, I would suggest that a more accurate acronym would be formed if the act were renamed the Republican Agitators Inflicting Nonsense on Us Today, or REIN Out. And that, I would suggest, is how we should dispose of this bill, as a REIN Out. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I'd be remiss if during this markup I didn't talk about the history of the REINS Act and where it came from. A brilliant man named Lloyd Rogers, who's a constituent of mine, grew up in an orphanage in Kentucky where he met the girl that would later become his wife. They were married for 65 years. He was a veteran. He served during the Korean War. And then he came back home and he was a county judge executive in Campbell County, Kentucky. And in his retirement, he became concerned about the drift in government from the legislative branch to the executive branch. So he came up with this idea that really isn't novel. It's the idea that our founders had, which is that all the laws should go through Congress. And so he came up with the REINS Act, and he went to his congressman. I wasn't the congressman at the time. The gentleman before me met with Judge Lloyd Rogers, retired Judge Lloyd Rogers, and took his idea and brought it back to Congress and put it through Leg Council, and that's how the REINS Act came to be. It was a citizen activist who was concerned about the structure of his government, having defended it during the Korean War and having served in local government. He was passionate enough to put this bill together. And so his name is Lloyd Rogers, and I'm sure he's watching this markup right now because he's very engaged. What I hear from the other side of the aisle, arguments against the REINS Act, one is that, well, we've got a CRA, we don't need the REINS Act. We've got a Congressional Review Act. But the Congressional Review Act is inoperable on about 95% maybe 98% of the regulations that pass, because the Congressional Review Act requires the president who promulgated, the president's administration promulgated a rule, it would require the president to sign on to cancel his own rule. There's only a narrow window of opportunity where the Congressional Review Act has ever been able to be used, and it's very rarely, because it has to act within a certain amount of time. The administration would have to change during that period of time, and that's why the Congressional Review Act is not suitable. It also turns, as Mr. Bishop pointed out, the legislative process on its head. Instead of requiring concurrent majorities in both chambers to agree to an idea, it requires, the Congressional Review Act requires concurrent majorities to disagree with an idea that which is presumed to be a law, even though it's just a rule that the executive branch has promulgated. And we should get away from calling them rules. These are laws. They're not rules. The pistol brace so-called rule, you get 10 years in prison for violating that. Give me a break. That's not a rule. That's a law. So the other argument that I hear from the other side of the aisle is that Congress is so dysfunctional that we can't be trusted with lawmaking. Oh my gosh, what if there's an emergency or something? Congress is just incapable of writing laws effectively. I reject that. If you give up on the idea that we are the lawmaking body, then you've given up on this republic and the structure that that our founding fathers put in place for our people to be self-governed. But I just want to close by thanking Judge Lloyd Rogers for introducing this bill to his congressman.
Gentleman yield.
And I'm going to yield back to Chairman Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think he's exactly right. The fundamental question is who decides? The, quote, experts, the technocracy, as Mr. Bishop described, or the elected officials? The elected officials who answer to Lloyd Rogers. Who's going to make the decision? That's the fundamental question here. I may not know, we may not know how many parts per billion is necessary to, we may not know that, but I do know one thing. Regulations and rules that impact the economy to the tune of millions and millions of dollars and impact the 800,000 folks I get to represent, that's important, and they get to talk to me. They get to talk to Thomas, Lloyd Rogers gets to talk to Thomas Massey. That is how our system works, and that is the fundamental question that we have to deal with, not just on this bill, but on so many things. We have deferred to the, quote, experts, the experts who think they can run our lives and never be held accountable. That is what this legislation is all about, and I appreciate the story and how this idea came into being from Mr. Rogers, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield now?
Well, no, and Lloyd Rogers doesn't get to talk to the faceless bureaucrats.
Exactly.
He gets to talk to his elected representatives. Now I yield to Mr. Biggs. 15 seconds.
I'm going to go fast. If you've ever been into Senator Mike Lee's office, you can go in and he has a very visual demonstration of this. 14 feet high, that's the annual regulations, about this high, 6 to 8 inches of what Congress puts out as laws. That's wrong.
Gentleman's time is expired. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes, I think, the gentlelady from, Ms. Dean, gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment and to the underlying bill. The REINS Act would grind the gears of rulemaking to a halt by requiring congressional assent to the major rules before they can take effect. Thinking about grinding things to a halt, I can't imagine why we are considering this again today when the majority party is right now threatening to grind our economy to a halt as we wait on this nonsensical negotiation with the majority party. This is a crisis that never should have happened, but they like to grind things to a halt. And what happens when that happens is we hurt our constituents. My constituents are worried that the REINS Act threatens the health and safety of all Americans who rely upon administrative agencies to ensure that our air is safe, that our water is safe to drink, that our food is safe to eat, and that life-saving medications will depend on safe, and that they depend upon are safe and effective. The REINS Act is based on a false premise that regulations harm economic employment growth. The data shows the exact opposite. With that, I just wish the majority party would focus on that which is important to the American people, safety for all Americans in their health and in their economy and in their climate, And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Maryland.
I thank you. I just had a couple quick points that I wanted to make. One, as someone who's worked on the Hill and actually run an administrative agency, it was a state agency, but we were implementing the Telecom Act. I got to say that the types of hearings we do are dramatically different from the types of hearings that you do in an administrative proceeding. We had hundreds of hours of testimony from people who are experts in their fields, engineering degrees, technical economists, all of that stuff, things that we just don't do with the hearings that we have. We can change that, but I gotta say, in the 35 years I've been dealing with Capitol Hill, I've never seen us do hearings like that on the House or the Senate side for that matter. I also wanted to raise this quick point with respect to constitutionality. I think there's a clear question as to whether this provision is in line with Chadha, the Supreme Court opinion. It doesn't appear to be to me. I took a look at the constitutional authority statement that came with the introduction of this bill. It cites Article 1, Section 8, and that's Provision 17, which is the necessary and proper clause, which really doesn't seem to have much to do with what we're trying to talk about here. By contrast, Chadha bases its decision on the legislative veto on Section 7 rather than Section 8, and talks in terms of the need, to my colleagues who are making constitutional arguments and the importance of following the Constitution, the importance of following the document as it was drafted by the founders. And the point that they make in reaching that holding, in part, is that there are only 4 points in the Constitution where either one house or the other has a role where it can do something on its own, either initiating impeachment, having a trial after impeachment is initiated, confirmation of appointments, and ratification of treaties.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will.
On that point, I think it is
Actually,
an interesting issue.
It's her term.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Whose time is it?
Well, I'll yield to you in her absence. Go ahead.
So just to get to that question. So Chadha said you can't have a legislative veto. You can't have something take effect and then the Congress by resolution say, a joint resolution say no, because it violates the presentment clause, right? You're not tendering something the Congress has acted on to the president. But isn't this different? And I've tried to look real quickly. I don't know the answer, frankly. Is there any state constitutional law where somebody's maybe taking a shot at this? Because this is different. It's a condition on the effectiveness of regulations. It's not, in other words, something else has to happen before it becomes law.
I'm reading it a little differently. I think what we're trying to do here is essentially amend the CRA and give a second bite at the apple. So it's the legislative veto after the statute's been passed, but then you can basically go back and limit the reach of the statute unilaterally or unicamerally, I guess. And so the issue I think here is in twofold. One is there's no explanation given with the introduction of this bill as to why it's constitutional. And I think it's clearly inconsistent with the spirit of what Chief Justice Berger wrote in Chadha with respect to, and I apologize for running over the time there, but inconsistent with the point that Chief Justice Berger made, which is there's a constitutional approach to dealing with this. We tried to circumvent that with the CRA. My colleagues on the Republican side are saying that's insufficient, but this isn't the option that was permitted by the opinion in Chadha.
Gentleman's time, or gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was listening to this debate, and I have some things I agree with the other side, that Congress is not doing its job. Over 90% of our spending is not authorized by Congress, which is our primary duty to authorize spending, and we're not doing our job. So maybe if we have to really spend more time looking at what's happening, maybe we'll start actually doing the important job for the American people. And as a matter of fact, the House majority did pass legislation related to debt ceiling, and it's right now the Senate majority that is not passing their bill, and I think they need to be held accountable because we did pass legislation and Chuck Schumer has to be accountable. Where is his bill? And that's a question should be asked, and then if we think about it, the administrative state grew so much, and it has the power to rewrite laws and now they adjudicate laws that even Justice Elena Kagan, in her recent opinion, which is justice who was appointed by President Obama, she wrote about, and she was referring to FTC, that FTC knows a good deal about competition policy, but nothing special about the separation of powers. And I think we have to really start thinking about it. Who are the real representatives and what we're allowed to do, to the other branch to write laws on our behalf where people don't have an ability to get rid of the people or even have an input, that maybe not representing their opinion. And we're not expert on every issues here, but ultimately if we need to have experts, we can bring them. Agency can bring, their, regulations to us and propose rules and they can, talk about that. But we also need to hear from real people on the ground because we're not legislating for them. They are executive branch to execute the policy the American people want. And if people don't want the policy, the only way they can voice their opinion is through us, through our branch. And if we are not doing our job, people become very, powerless. And if we can see with the growth of the government, the power of the people decrease, and large corporations getting richer and richer, and now we have oligopolies and oligarchs controlling almost every sector of our economy. And this is very dangerous, what we have, because we are turning into the country where all of the power sits in Washington, D.C., and our founding fathers were very afraid of that. So I think our branch should get our act together and start legislating for the people. So I think it's a good legislation, it's a good step forward, but I think we need to do even more, because if we are not going to be doing our job here, then we shouldn't really not be elected to these positions. We should just stay home and not waste taxpayers' money coming here and just doing like talking heads, doing presentations. We're here to legislate on behalf of the people, and people have such a frustration. We actually have a lower approval rating than president does, okay? We can complain about Brett. Congress has a very high disapproval rating, and rightly so. So I hope people will pay attention more what's happening here, and I think we need to support legislation like that, and I support this amendment and support this bill, and I will yield my time to the gentle lady from Wyoming.
Thank you. I think there's just an absolute fundamental difference in philosophy and a complete misunderstanding on the other side of the aisle as to how agencies actually work. We're continuously hearing about the EPA keeping our water safe and our air safe and things like that. The EPA doesn't keep our water safe or our air safe. Those duties are handled by states and municipalities. The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't manage wildlife. The states and landowners manage wildlife. Using the EPA as an example, the EPA does not focus on clean water. It instead wields its powers trying to dramatically expand its authority in order to take control over things that it has absolutely no legal authority to manage. I'll give you an example. Under the Clean Water Act, it only applies to navigable waters of the United States. Yet I have had lawsuits with the EPA where they've attempted to define irrigation ditches as navigable waters of the United States and brought enforcement actions against farmers who've done nothing more than clean out their irrigation ditches. That's the problem that we are facing. That's where the courts have had to intervene, is that our agencies have been taking more and more power well outside of the statutory authority that has been granted to them by us. And it's through such things as the Chevron deference doctrine that courts have then deferred to their interpretation or misinterpretation of the statutes that they are allegedly applying. What this law does is it just simply states that the legislative branch will legislate, nothing more and nothing less. This is
time of the
I yield back. Thank you.
time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee, gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me this very brief moment. I am delighted to hear of the rising voices that are concerned about the American people. that means that we're all going to rush to the floor today under martial law and raise the debt ceiling, stop the default. That is the evidence of my friends on the other side. They are standing up for the people of the United States. They're standing up for 30 million veterans who lose their medical appointments. They're standing up for parents who will lose Head Start seats. They are standing up for military personnel who won't have housing or food, substance. They are standing up for Social Security recipients and Medicare persons and Medicaid recipients. That's a good thing. So maybe we can finish this markup, convene on the floor, and stop the default. But when it comes to the interpretation of the REINS Act, it is a inexplicable response to the three branches of government, because there are three branches of government: Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. And they are to work with the respective responsibilities. With an election and the leadership of the head of state, the President of the United States, comes obligations, responsibilities, and benefits. And that is the process of being able to utilize the process of a regulatory structure. And as my friend from Maryland said, in the course of state regulatory structures and federal, there is a large amount of hearings, evidence, witnesses. There's the response that the American people allowed after a rule is promulgated. You have a time to provide comments. That's not seen much with respect to these kinds of legislation. In fact, the REINS Act, that has been introduced almost as many times as I've been in the United States Congress, and no one wants to hear me say how long that is, has never gone further in the Senate than a hearing. That's as far as it's gone. And as I understand it, in Congress, there are two bodies. This will be not a stop sign, but a tsunami against any functioning need that the American people have. And I highlight precisely the amount of dangerous toys that have been kept off the streets because of the regulatory structure, or baby formula that have been vetted over and over through the regulatory process to stop babies from dying. So to have a regulatory structure with three branches of government, where the Article 1 branch stops all regulation, good and in between, to wait on them for a vote, when my colleague has just said of the overall reputation that Congress has, I don't see to the work of good members who come here every day, have taken an oath, and want to do their best. Not even to my friends on the other side of the aisle. So the collective vote of confidence, I separate out from hardworking members. But the member has already said what our general image is, and you want to give us the authority to run the government by literally a tsunami of opposition, stagnation, ineffectiveness, not getting to where we need to be? Because that's what you're claiming that you will overcome if you use this law. And my view of it is that you will just stop government in its tracks. And frankly, I believe in government. I believe in local government, state government, even in opposition to some of the things that they're doing. I think we can do good if we do it together. And it is amazing to be here in America where the entity that you call on a rainy day, or fire, or tornado, or even in California, an earthquake, the United States of America. And what good is it to stop this nation from doing its patriotic duty, its response to its people, to come when they are in need. For those who may have some difficulty with some of the laws,
Gentlelady's time's expired.
that is the nature of our business, Mr. Chairman, and I just say democracy demands that we oppose the REINS Act. I yield back.
Yes, ma'am. Gentlelady yields back, and Chair recognizes Mr. Roy from Texas. 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I noticed there's been a lot of comments about, this being dangerous. This is dangerous. This empowerment of Article 1 in the Constitution, the People's House and the Senate, it's dangerous to empower Congress. I want to remind the American people that it is your representatives that you hired to come to Washington and represent you that are sitting here in the House Judiciary Committee, a committee charged with defending the Constitution of the United States, that is looking at you and all of this country and saying, we would rather empower the administrative state under Article 2 in the Constitution than do our job to defend the Constitution of the United States as your representative. That is what your representative is saying to you. And they're saying it emphatically. They are saying it with passion. They're not even just ignoring it, they're actually fighting to give more power to the administrative state, more power to the bureaucracy, more power to Article 2, under a Constitution specifically designed, fought for, to ensure that wouldn't be the case. That gives you a glimpse into the problem that we face today, that an all-powerful government is somehow preferred, that an all-powerful government with bureaucrats unchecked by the people's representatives is the preferred state in the 21st century in America by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. There's been a lot of pointing at the REINS Act as being dangerous and a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth of the calamity that we face with respect to the debt ceiling. I would remind my colleagues and the American people that in the legislation put forward by Republicans, Limit, Save, Grow, that we're fighting to cut the inflationary spending by $1 trillion in year one and $5 trillion over a decade. Our Democratic colleagues want to keep the status quo of record inflation and record spending. We want to cut the spending of the woke federal bureaucracy that's at war with the American people, that is targeting former presidents and targeting the American citizenry, interfering with their ability to live free and prosper economically. We want to limit that simply to pre-COVID levels, something that polls at 76%. Our Democrat colleagues want to expand it. We're fighting for reliable energy and for the working class and hardworking American families, but our Democratic colleagues want to preserve their fat cat subsidies for unreliable energy to the wealthy, to the elite, to corporations and to Chinese communists. 90% of subsidies going to billion-dollar corporations, 80% of EV subsidies going to individuals making over $100,000 or couples making over $300,000. That is your modern Democratic Party, the party of corporate subsidy. We're fighting for the plumber with no student loans and the veteran that sacrificed for the nation. Democrats are bailing out people with master's degree in gender studies. We are fighting for poor and middle-class Americans that are already targeted by the Internal Revenue Service at higher rates. Black Americans 3 times more, poor 5 times more. Democrats, not yet. Democrats want to expand the IRS to go after those Americans even more. We are fighting to reassert Congress's role right here in this committee. We're debating this matter over an executive branch pumping out new regulations that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Democrats want to empower these faceless bureaucrats. We are fighting to restore the dignity of work in this country. Our Democratic colleagues want to continue to destroy families and communities by spending billions to keep Americans at home. We simply want to restore the work requirements that Bill Clinton signed and Joe Biden voted for, and our colleagues can't even sit down to agree to that which was already accepted previously by our Democratic colleagues. We are fighting to preserve an American dream that is increasingly out of reach for Americans. Our Democratic colleagues want to destroy that dream. And here we debate the REINS Act, designed very specifically to pull back the regulatory state. And I would just add with respect to the student loan issue. Remember that it was Speaker Pelosi who said, people think the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress. And here we are with our Democratic colleagues in the Judiciary Committee yielding that power, not wanting to reclaim that power. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm frankly gobsmacked by the logic being used by the other side to argue that somehow democracy demands that we defeat this legislation, which is designed to empower the people through their elected representatives under Article 1. The idea that somehow by permitting this bill, we would threaten our commitment to clean water or clean air or safe drugs, ensure that benefits that people depend on are delivered on time. The argument essentially is that Congress should not be trusted with determining such things. And in doing so, they argue that the people who elect us should not be empowered to determine such things. Because by passing the REINS Act, you actually do empower Congress. You empower the elected, those who elect the members of Congress to make those decisions. So what does this bill really mean? God forbid it should mean that we're actually here more than 4 days a week. God forbid it should mean that we actually vote on more than a few bills a day. But I'm ready to work, and it may be hard for some members to adjust to on the other side, but I would say that we should do this for the people we represent to ensure that these regulations that are promulgated by a bureaucracy that is unresponsive. The Department of Health and Human Services from 2001 to 2017 issued 2,952 rules. 77% were unconstitutionally issued without a principal agency officer approval. So nobody accountable to the people signed off on these regs. Of the Food and Drug Administration final rules, 98% were invalid. So we've got an unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy issuing thousands and thousands of rules, and the American people are unrepresented. So
would the gentleman yield for a question?
This legislation is important for that purpose, and for those who were upset about the bill that was passed by this body to actually address the debt limit, you may not have liked the bill, but you can't deny that this body passed the bill. In fact, this is the only body that passed a bill, and you also can't deny that none of you voted for it. So the crisis that is occurring belongs completely, the crisis blame belongs at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and the other end of the hallway in the Senate for their failure to put forward any kind of proposal that could pass muster in the Senate. And with that, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman for a question.
In your view, why is this bill constitutional under the Supreme Court principles enunciated in Chadha?
The bill is constitutional because it retains those powers which were delegated to the administrative agencies in the first place. It's within Congress's authority to take back those powers which were delegated. So I see no problem with the constitutionality of it, and I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Arizona for his comments as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. So in Chadha, you had a kind of a bizarre situation where a bill was taken up in Judiciary Committee, but not ever taken up. I shouldn't say it was referred to, but it was removed from Judiciary and was taken to the floor for a vote. Now, what Chadha turned on was that particular piece of legislation actually was removing a regulation that had already been put in place, and it was doing so without bicameralism, without presentment. What this bill does is completely different. It effectively blocks a regulation from becoming effective. That's very, very different than taking regulation that's there and without bicameralism and without presentment, then stepping in. That's why this bill, it doesn't even fall under CHATA, because just the process that we've had here. This does not allow a single house. It requires the bicameralism, and it actually kind of, in a way, presumes that regulation doesn't take effect until we approve it. That's why the language of the approval is actually set forth in the REINS Act itself. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired, and Chair recognizes Mr. Liu, California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The arrogance that I've heard from some members across the aisle is astounding. Let me just put it out to you this way. Do you want members of Congress to decide if a particular drug cures pneumonia? I mean, I know we're like all that. No one here has any idea. You want the experts and doctors of the FDA to do that, right? Do you want members of Congress to determine if certain brake systems on cars work or not? I mean, I know we're all that, but we have no idea about that. You want people at the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency to look at that. Do you want members of Congress to determine if a particular airplane is worthy for flight in commercial airspace? I know members across the aisle think we're really smart and we should be doing all this stuff. Or do you want the experts at the FAA who know what they're doing to look at this? Let's go back to reality here. We're in a modern world. There are lots of things members of Congress simply do not know. We don't have the expertise. We rely on federal agencies, and they do a pretty damn good job. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman.
Yield, Mr. Liu?
Yielded back.
Well, I did yield back, but if I could reclaim that, I'll give it back to you.
All right, I'll let you do it this time.
Thank you. I'll yield to Mr. Johnson.
Well, the chairman,
I yield to the chairman.
Thank you. I've been meaning to ask this question of the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey. He indicted, in effect, the Congressional Review Act and said it was useless. Would the gentleman be interested in helping repeal it?
No, I said it's inoperable for about 98% of regulations.
So would you be interested in repealing such an inoperable?
No, I'd like to amend it with the REINS Act.
Okay. I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yes, we talk about Congress taking over the rulemaking apparatus of the federal agencies so that we can bring it back to the people who've elected us so that they can have an impact on the regulations, which they already do, by the way, through the notice and comment period associated with promulgation of rules. But once a rule has been put in place, then the agencies hear from consumers, they hear from stakeholders, they hear from businesses, they hear from other governmental agencies seeking to be in compliance or asking questions about a particular rule. Do my friends on the other side of the aisle think that their offices are set up to address the many phone calls and inquiries that are coming in from all of the stakeholders about a rule that Congress might promulgate? Do we actually think that the legislative branch has the capacity to administer a rule? I mean, that's nonsense. Come on, people, let's wake up. This is about defunding the federal government. This is about putting in place an apparatus where every man is for himself, every woman is for herself, and by the way, women are not equal to men in that kind of a society. There's no protection for women, no protection for babies, no protection for anyone's health, safety, and well-being. It's just open season by the corporations and the wealthy. That's what my Republican friends are advocating for with this, this change. Is one step in that process, and we've gone too far. It's time for America to wake up and realize that government is of, by, and for the people. It's us, including the people who man those agencies. Those are our relatives, those are our friends, those are our neighbors. We're working for the common good, not just for the sake of wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, is recognized.
You know, I almost can't believe I'm hearing this, so I'm gonna, as best I can, in the way that I do, try to straighten this out a little bit. This has nothing to do with thinking that women are inferior. In fact, quite frankly, this bill has nothing to do with a responsible debt ceiling. But what folks on the other side are doing, again, as they continue to do, is let the American people who are watching this on TV look at the shiny object over here, because we don't want them to see what the real deal is. I've served at every level of government. I've been a mayor, I've been a councilman, I've been a county commissioner, I've been a state legislator in the Senate and the House. And let me tell you, I talk to a lot of people. If there's anything I do in life, is I get out in the street and I talk to people. And there aren't a lot of people who think, boy, the regulatory process is great. You know, dentists and doctors aren't saying, I love the way that they're regulating me because it's really helping patients, because it isn't. Small businesses aren't feeling that way. People who are trying to work in the workaday world, who work for other companies, aren't feeling that way. And my friend, Mr. Johnson, he talks about the big corporations. They're able to deal with it because they're big, they're powerful, they have a lot of money, so they can deal with this excessive regulation. We do have a responsibility in Congress. We're not going to be administering every minor issue that comes along and have an administrative branch in each and one of our congressional offices. What we are saying is something that other people call sometimes legislative intent. I don't know how many times I've seen a bill passed in Congress. I've seen a bill passed in the House of the House in literally the state of New Jersey or any state, and it doesn't represent what the people want, and it doesn't represent what the legislators want. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the way it works. We work hard. We go out. We talk to people. They tell us we need to do something. We pass a law, and then you need to have an appropriate action with that law, not the stuff that we're doing now where we literally just go forward, pass a law, and then whatever a particular regulatory group wants to do may be very different than the law we passed, very different than what the people want. And people also mentioned that, we were talking about the responsible debt ceiling and talking about our bill, and somehow that got brought into this. I don't know how. Let me just say that Republicans believe that women are totally equal. I don't know how that got brought into this. I don't know how this bill would hurt women. I don't know how it would hurt babies, the ones trying to protect babies. And you know what people want when you talk about a debt ceiling? Damn it, do you know what people want? They want us to stop spending. They want a responsible debt ceiling. They want our government to control itself. They don't want it to waste money. And when it does spend, they want it to spend on things that protect the American public and that protect our American country. But we go astray. I hear things that are so far astray. That's not what this bill does, the things that you're saying. It doesn't do any of those things. What it does is make sure that literally the laws that we pass in the country we have reflect the values of the people who live and work in this great United States. And they reflect those values through their Congress. And if their congressman or congresswoman isn't doing that, they lose the damn election. They lose the election. And then we move on. That's the way we work. But not some, high-end regulatory group that doesn't have to listen to everybody, that tells you how to live your life, how to legislate, how to do every part of the government and how it should function. That is not how it was meant to be. That is not what we want. It is not what the American people want. And if anybody wants to go out and walk the streets with me and talk to some folks and ask them if they want more regulation, do they believe we have too much regulation? They will all tell you that we do and that they're tired of it. It doesn't mean we don't need some regulation. But no, I want to finish this up. I'm sorry. But you know what? The bottom line is regulation is obviously a necessity, but good government and listening to the people of America is why we are here. It isn't to have regulatory agencies run our lives and do things to us that we never intended and don't want. So we do have a voice in it. This is America. People have a voice, and we have a voice. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the chair. Mr. Roy, I wanted to visit with you about a few of the comments you made earlier, if you're willing to engage with me.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, do you know approximately in the last few Congresses that we've served together, how many bills passed by suspension?
Well, I don't know the number, but it is a large number.
In the hundreds?
Hundreds, yeah, hundreds of bills by suspension.
And other than our friend from Kentucky, most of the people in the House vote for those bills that pass by suspension.
I might have the second most number of no's to my friend from Kentucky, but it was pretty high. And by the way, we objected to a lot of that in order to protect the American people.
Right, and make sure that we had the time to read those bills before we voted for those bills. But if there was a common sense regulation that was passed by the administration that cost more than $100 million, would it be fair to say that that bill could be brought under suspension fairly quickly, passed, and we would have the result where Congress, Article I Congress, saw that and certainly a drug that's going to save lives?
It's certainly possible to do that under the rules.
And isn't it true, or let me just ask you, I won't do a leading question, but when the Magna Carta was signed, did it require the Parliament to yield to the King, or did it require the King to yield to the Parliament?
It was fairly revolutionary in the transformation.
And isn't our Constitution based on that same concept?
It is.
And isn't Article I of our Constitution dealing with legislative power because our founders believed that Article I was the most important article in the Constitution?
Absolutely.
And aren't we on a hill overlooking the executive branch because we are supposed to be overlooking the functions of the executive branch? Isn't that the plan that they came up with to make sure that the visual was there, that the White House is lower geographically than Congress, the White House looks up to Congress, and there is a mall that people can gather on and petition Congress. You can't walk into the White House and get through security. You can walk into your member's office, knock on the door, and ask to speak to your member. You can't go to the Supreme Court and ask to speak to a Supreme Court justice. You can in this Congress. We are accessible as opposed to the administration. And isn't that what the REINS Act is all about, is asking people, bureaucrats, to understand that we're responsible. We've got the power of the purse. We're responsible to the people, and they should come to us if they have a need for an expensive regulation.
Yeah, the gentleman from Colorado is correct, and that is what is so extraordinary about how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle just seem to just whisk away the whole purpose of a republic. The whole reason that we have a republic where we're supposed to represent our constituents and do so in such a way that we are restraining a burdensome, powerful, and potentially tyrannical executive branch. It was literally why our system was created, and all we're trying to do here, and by the way, was supported on a bipartisan basis in previous years. This passed on a bipartisan basis in 2017. Only now do our colleagues believe somehow standing up for Article I over Article II is going to be dangerous, in their words.
And is this REINS Act, does it apply equally to a Republican administration and a Democrat administration?
It does and should.
And are there subcommittees set up in the House so that subcommittees could hear these very important, very expensive regulations and make recommendations to the body?
Absolutely. And by the way, to the arguments of saying there's all these experts over the administrative state, I would posit that that's part of the problem. But if they're going to bring their expertise, they can present that in summary form and say, here's why this regulation is necessary, and we can make a decision in subcommittees or committees as to whether or not it's worth $100 million and doesn't step on the rights of our citizens or doesn't spend money that we don't have. We can do that.
And my friends on the other side of the aisle keep talking about a democracy, and you keep talking about a republic. Could you tell me the difference, please?
Well, and it seems like that is completely lost in this town, that we created a republic on purpose so that those of us who represent our constituents can come here and make decisions that we think is beneficial for the republic, and keep in mind the laws, keep in mind the Constitution, and make those decisions as representatives of the people, not through the direct decisions made by the people. I would make one note on that point. I had to go through that decision-making in January of 2021, as did you, and make a decision that I had to then go explain to the people of my district why I made a choice, because that's how this works in a republic.
You want to yield?
Yes.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Louisiana.
In 6 seconds, democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner. The founders were afraid of that. It's not majority rules, it's constitutional republic. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madison pointed out that when all the powers of government are concentrated in the same hands, you have tyranny. That's why the founders meticulously divided the powers of government. Those are the checks and balances that we all learned at school, or though some of us seem to have forgotten them. All legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress of the United States, not some of the legislative powers, all of those powers. Congress makes law but cannot enforce it. The president enforces law but cannot make it, and an independent judiciary resolves its disputes. The founders wanted every law to be made by representatives of the people who were accountable to the people. They wanted every voice in America heard through their representatives before a law was made. They wanted it to be hard to make law. They split the legislative branch into two houses and gave those two houses different perspectives so they'd even argue with each other. The modern regulatory state puts all of these powers back in single hands. An unelected agency writes the law, then it enforces the law that it has just written. And if it accuses you of violating that law, you have to answer to the agency in a court run by that agency without a jury, and the agency keeps the fines it assesses on you. Is there any more profound threat to a democracy than that? 10 times more laws are written by the regulatory agencies today than by the people's representatives. Americans now have 10 times the chance of being hauled into an administrative law court for breaking an agency regulation than they have being charged with a statutory crime where they have the full protection of the Bill of Rights. My only problem with this bill is that Congress is supposed to make all law. The president decides whether to sign or veto it. This bill still has it backwards. The president's agencies make law and Congress then approves it, but at least it's a step back from the precipice. Now, to Mr. Liu's question, do you want Congress making these decisions or leave it to the experts? Well, we all know the saying that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Relying on experts without taking into account all of the factors outside of their expertise is dangerous folly. Democracies don't always make the best decisions, but they make the best decisions that are acceptable to the most people. We've just endured the madness of experts, lockdowns and mandates the expert told us would spread the slow of the disease. And we now have study after study documenting that their measures not only failed to do that, but did incalculable damage to the economy, to the education of our children, to the public's overall health. They needlessly cost lives who delayed health screenings and treatments, drug and alcohol-related deaths, increased suicide rates. No representative voted for these measures. The regulatory state simply imposed them. Lord Salisbury put it this way more than a century ago. He said, "No lesson seems to be so deeply inculcated by the experience of life as that you never should trust experts. If you believe the doctors, nothing is wholesome. If you believe the theologians, nothing is innocent. If you believe the soldiers, nothing is safe. They all require to have their strong wine diluted by a very large admixture of insipid common sense." That is why we have a Congress, to weigh all of those opinions and to sort through them. You know, experts are there to advise us from every perspective, but it's then our responsibility on behalf of the people to sort through their perspectives and advice and chart a course that takes into account all of the issues at hand and be accountable to the people for those decisions. In 1848, Alex de Tocqueville issued this warning that I think is as important to us today as it was to his audience so many years ago. He said, "The trait which best describes socialists of all schools and shades is a profound opposition to personal liberty and scorn for individual reason, a complete contempt for the individual. They unceasingly attempt to mutilate, to curtail, to obstruct personal freedom in any and all ways. They hold that the state must not only act as the director of society, but must further be master of each man, and not only master, but keeper and trainer. For fear of allowing him to err, the state must place itself forever by his side, above him, around him, better to guide him, to maintain him, in a word, to confine him. They call, in fact, for the forfeiture to a greater or less degree of human liberty, to the point where, were I to attempt to sum up what socialism is, I would say that it was simply a new system of serfdom." And Mr. Chairman, throughout American history, that party has not changed this fundamental belief. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from, the question occurs on the gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, before you proceed with the question, I would like to proceed with a question, but I've been asked to do this, so without objection, I'll withdraw my amendment.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment. Oh, okay. Okay. But the question in front of the committee is the question now on the amendment, but unless you want to amend that. Oh.
Without objection.
Oh.
Without objection, I'll withdraw.
Without objection, it's withdrawn.
Where we go? Yeah. Okay. Gentleman from New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
I want her to withdraw that amendment. Reserve point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277 offered by Mr.
Without
Nadler.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would exempt rules made by the Environmental Protection Agency from the approval requirements of the REINS Act. As I noted in my opening statement, the REINS Act would stall the work of government by requiring both chambers of commerce to vote to approve and the president to sign any rule being considered by the executive branch. This amendment would exempt the vital rules promulgated by the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA ensures that the air we breathe is clean and free of dangerous pollutants. By one estimate, the EPA's regulatory enforcement of the Clean Air Act has prevented over 200,000 early deaths. Access to safe drinking water is a basic human right, and we rely on the experts at the EPA to make sure that our water is free of toxic pesticides and harmful chemicals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. It issues regulations to protect our communities from chemical spills and contaminated sites. It protects us from the ravages of climate change. But supporters of this bill want to hamstring the EPA and undermine its ability to issue vital regulations to keep our water safe and our air safe. Our water safe to drink and our air safe to breathe. My amendment would ensure that while this bill may grind to a halt other agency rulemaking, at least the EPA would be able to continue its critical work of protecting our health and safety. I ask that my colleagues support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman withdraws his point of order. Gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hagman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment. There is no reason to carve out certain types of rules from the requirements of the REINS Act. Congress remains free to regulate in a very detailed way without these carve-outs, and so too do administrative agencies. The REINS Act already contains exceptions for emergencies, national security, enforcement of criminal laws, and implementation of trade agreements. Other major rules are appropriately subject to Congress's consideration and approval before they go into effect. And the fact is that these sorts of issues may be significant, makes it all the more important that Congress consider and approve them before they can take effect. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
I would just add a couple notes in regards to this. I can give you an example over the EPA initiated rulemaking. It was a little over a decade ago, and there was a local paper mill in my district that built it was about a $10 to $15 million smokestack as a result of that administrative rule that had been put in place. The person and head of environmental compliance at that paper mill, I asked them, how much benefit did the environment get from that? Zero. Nothing. They had to build the smokestack because of an edict from the EPA. The EPA did not study whether it would actually do environmental good. It did none then. It continues to do none, but you can see that smokestack yet today. So think about what was displaced as a result of that. They spent about $10 to $15 million. So employees didn't get some raises that they might have been able to get. There might have been other environmental improvements that the company could have made with that $10 to $15 million. Those were sidelined, as well as safety improvements at the plant were sidelined as a result of having to take a finite amount of capital, in this case $10 to $15 million, and to spend it on something that does not work. And I would say to you, we also have a rule that was attempted to pass as a law. Our former home state Senator Feingold tried to pass the waters of the United States. He authored that bill almost 20 years ago. And that bill has never been able to make it through the Congress of the United States. But the agencies have been trying to pass it as a rule. In fact, we just did a CRA on it, I believe. Waters of the United States, which would regulate every single drop of water here in our country, where every state across the country has their own EPA. In my state, we call it the Department of Natural Resources, that do those type of regulatory things. So here you had the waters of the United States, which could not pass through the United States Congress at the will of the people. It gets done via regulatory fiat by the agencies. Those are just a couple of practical examples of why this is not a good idea. First of all, why the bill is a good idea, the REINS Act, but it's a really bad idea to carve out agencies which will continue to act with impunity. I yield back to the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
And I would provide additional examples that the EPA is probably one of the most abusive agencies in terms of attempting to expand its authority and the definitions and the statutory framework under which it is to act. The Clean Water Act is just one example of that, with the effort over the last many years with the EPA attempting to expand what is defined as a navigable water of the United States by redefining what is meant by that phrase. Again, attempting to define an irrigation ditch as a navigable water of the United States. The EPA has repeatedly been informed that they are exceeding their authority in their efforts to do that, as well as under the Clean Water Act. So the one agency that is probably one of the most abusive in terms of ignoring the statutory framework and proceeding with regulations is the EPA. What's significant about that is in attempting to take control over all water in the United States, not just navigable waterways as defined in the statute, or in their effort to expand what the Clean Air Act says, the regulations that they are adopting literally have impacts of not 50 million, not 100 million, but hundreds of millions and billions and even trillions of dollars of impacts on our economy with these regulations. If there was any agency that should be reined in by the REINS Act, it is the EPA. And it's not because Republicans want dirty air or dirty water, it's that we want the agencies to comply with the statutes, and the EPA consistently does not. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This should not be an argument confined to whether or not the EPA has been abusive in its definition of whether or not a particular body of water is a navigable water or not. especially when you have the health and safety of people at stake that the EPA addresses. For instance, and I would venture to suspect that not many members of Congress know much about PFAS, PFAS, but the EPA is in the process of promulgating a rule that will protect our drinking water, that will help make it clean by banning certain substances from being in our water. And those substances are polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. The proposed PFAS National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, which was announced on March 14th of 2023, proposed that 6 PFAS, including perfluorooctanoic acid and other substances, 6 of them, commonly known as Gen X chemicals, these substances be monitored and banned from our drinking water to protect Americans. And the reason why the EPA exists is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of Americans, not to determine whether or not a particular body of water is navigable, even though they do that. But their primary mission is to protect the health and safety of Americans. That's what they are in the process of doing with this new PFAS rule. And that's why I support this amendment, because it will exempt the EPA from the provisions of the underlying bill. The EPA, as I have stated, exists to protect our health, safety, and well-being, and I suspect why we keep using the EPA as an example of administrative overreach is because that is the agency that is a pain in the butt to the Koch brothers and other fossil fuel interests, corporate interests that fuel the dark money that runs these campaigns that elect those who support their policies. And so if they want to get elected, they've got to go with the dark money. And the dark money is Koch brothers and others. They tend to foul up our environment in the pursuit of corporate profits. They don't care about tomorrow. They don't care about climate change. They don't care about environmental protection. All they care about is profits. And so this underlying legislation rewards those who would foul up our environment with the ability to do so unencumbered by regulation. We need these regulations to protect us. I mean, we're just reading about how the FDA, being undermanned, is trying to now get at this issue of people who have been losing their eyesight, and 5 people have died because of their use of unregulated eye drops coming in from overseas. People are dying, and people are losing their vision and actually losing their eyeballs. And you know, what we want to do is take away the FDA's ability to regulate in this area? No, I don't think so. Not every member of Congress, especially on this side of the aisle, are willing to give away the health, safety, and well-being of our constituents so that somebody can make a fast dollar. And with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I do.
Yeah, I would just make the gentleman aware that David Koch died a couple of years ago, and so Charles is running what was previously known as the Koch brothers.
And the legacy continues.
You may want to go to a singular rather than a double in the future, my friend.
They both have left a powerful legacy.
Gentlemen's
both
time.
of them.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana. Would the gentlelady yield just 10 seconds for unanimous consent?
Yes, I yield.
In the vein of reining in these agencies that are, I think, in so many ways out of control, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter that I sent today to the IRS Commissioner, Mr. Warfall, regarding the situation of an FBI agent knocking on Mr. Taibbi, a journalist's door, IRS, yeah, excuse me. I would ask unanimous consent to enter that record and letter into the record. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me, without objection?
Without objection.
So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Busy handing it to you, Mr. Ranking Member. Gentlelady's recognized. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to concur with gentlelady from Wyoming that actually EPA probably is the most abusive agencies, and actually Supreme Court ruled last year on their complete overreach of their power and authority delegated on the Clean Air Act, and what they're doing with Clean Water Act is actually, I would argue that trying to take private property rights by the government, private property abusing the power of the government, and when governments try to take your private property, this is actually a communism by Karl Marx. It's not even socialism, and it's very dangerous, and I'll be honest with you, look at the P&Ls and financials of all large corporations and all these big funds like BlackRock. They're doing just fine with all of the regulations that my Democrat colleagues issued. They're making a lot of money. But who is getting hurt is the little guy, that farmer or some business owner that cannot afford to hire lawyers and CPA for $1,000 an hour, that cannot afford to go and lobby to every government level and sitting in the offices and trying to make their case. That's who's getting screwed. And we now have a situation now where all of the so-called dark money doing just fine, but the little guy has no ability now to be able to start a business and be able to compete and have abilities to make money. I think this is a very dangerous situation where we're now concentrating the power close to the government, close to Washington, D.C., and giving the power to the bureaucracies that people have no ability to even have an input. I mean, this is crazy, and this is very dangerous for our country. And I will tell you, I mean, EPA is so creative. They do the suicidal gimmicks, to try to violate even Administrative Procedures Act. They're doing all these definitions, They use and they pay people to come into committees and lobby on something that doesn't help the people. But in reality, that's what's happening with all of these environmental regulations that we put. Because when they're unfeasible, what's happened right now? That we're killing, destroying businesses in our country, and companies like BlackRock are part of it. And they're given a lot of power. They don't have to follow the rules. But what's happening? We're burning coal from China. We're helping Russia to make a lot of money, and American companies are getting screwed. And our pollution has net effect higher than that was before. Because when we push our companies to do business in lawless and corrupt countries and dictatorship, they collude in the same environment. We don't build the walls, from China or anywhere else. In the same ocean, and all pollution goes. Instead of have reasonable laws, the representative of the people and the businesses here, and help our people and our companies and our Americans to succeed. So this is just dumb. And if you think about it, some of these funds, that wasn't this, climate change agenda of BlackRock, like British funds, that actually, there are some activists that are honest, and I actually respect if someone is honest, and not hypocrite. If you want to drive everyone a bike and you're driving a bike, I respect you. But if you're flying big jet fuel jets and you want me to ride a bike, well, screw you. You're not going to tell me what to do. This is wrong. You have no power to do that. And these big companies have no right to tell us what to do. And I think we as legislators need to think about it, who we're representing, because these agencies do not represent with the people. They represent big special interest group. People rotate between them. They get in jobs and lobbying and careers and all of these different companies, and they're promulgating these rules to benefit large special interest groups. And now they are becoming so powerful that everyone is afraid to challenge them. And I think if we are not going to go back and think, what are we doing here? We're going to destroy our our country, how it is known and how it was set up, and it is very, very dangerous. So our branch has to get our act together and start doing our job and not be afraid of administrative state, not be afraid of large corporation and big money that coming from all directions, but we actually remember that this republic is set up in being the greatest republic in the history of the world for only reason there is no difference between the people, because the people have the most power and freedoms, and if we take these freedoms away from we the people, we're going to unfortunately abandon and betray all the people who die for our freedoms. I yield back.
Excuse me, the gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition on the gentleman from New York's amendment? The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield to my good friend from Wyoming.
Thank you. I just want to point out that the other irony about this proposed amendment is that the EPA is responsible for one of the worst environmental disasters in the history of the United States when they blew out the Gold King mine in southwestern Colorado and turned the Animas River orange. Just please Google Animas River in Orange and you can see the environmental disaster that was created by the EPA that has still not been cleaned up, and no one in the EPA has been held responsible or liable for the disaster that was created in August of 2015. Again, the EPA is responsible for one of the worst environmental disasters for a waterway in the history of the United States. With that, I yield back.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield to my friend, Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, quite frankly, what you see here today is two very different philosophies. And it's really a shame because, as Mr. Roy pointed out earlier, last time the REINS Act passed, it was a bipartisan issue. Not anymore, because what you're seeing, quite frankly, is that our colleagues across the aisle, they just cannot imagine a world without the Leviathan of big government kind of regulating every aspect of their life. But with regard to EPA, I just want to point out a real homely example from my home state. DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, is, as Ms. Hagman pointed out, it's the state environmental agencies that actually implement the imposed federal standards upon them. So one of my favorite stories is we were told in Phoenix that you guys are non-attaining, right? Because you have too many particulates in your air. And we say, okay, what's the particulate? What's the biggest problem? By a large margin, in a huge city in the desert, what do you think it would be? You got it, dust. We had dust. That's what we had. EPA was there. You got to take care of dust. And what did they tell us to do? We want you to use water to wet down your areas. This is in a city that gets 7 inches of rain a year. 5 million people live there. You got 7 inches of rain, and they want us to water down everything. And so we still have to do that. You're doing a construction site. You're watering it down. You know what? We have. I think it's either Google or Facebook putting in a big. They're both putting in big facilities in my district. One of them actually paved their roads for construction because they knew that they would have to waste water to mitigate against the dust. That's the kind of logic you get when you get the experts of the EPA in Washington, D.C. in a cubicle telling you what you have to do. This amendment is wrong-headed, and I think I'm looking forward to us just voting it down. And with that, I'll yield back to Mr. Moore.
Mr. Chairman, I feel like a ping pong ball.
Yeah.
I'll yield to Mr. Ray.
You believe that?
I mean Roy, I'm sorry.
I think the gentleman from Alabama. The only thing I would add to my friend from Arizona is I think the gentleman's aware that a significant number of the rules that we have problems with are coming out of the EPA. It's kind of the whole point. We have the EPA electric vehicle rule with the 2/3 EVs by 2023. We have rules regarding power plant rule, 90% emission cuts by 2040. All of these being done unilaterally by an EPA that doesn't give a whit about what that's going to do to the American people, making massive policy decisions, enormous policy decisions by fiat out of an agency to the president. making decisions that are undermining our ability to live freely, but also, frankly, often the environment itself. There was a story just last week how solar farms took over the California desert. An oasis has become a Dead Sea. There's example after example of how the environmental movement, which is all about moving an agenda, it's not about making sure our environment is healthy and good, it's about moving an agenda. And this agenda is being moved by bureaucrats. The very bureaucrats we're trying to say ought to be checked by the elected representatives. So this amendment is literally the exact wrong direction to go, because this is the agency that may present the best case for needing congressional oversight to stop the radical leftist agenda. And I'll yield back to the gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Roy, if I'm correct, too, the tax credits in the IRA, 90% of them go to corporations that make more than $1 billion a year.
Correct.
And that's part of the negotiations right now, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment from the gentleman from New York. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from New York.
I request the recorded vote.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Spartz? Ms. Spartz votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes aye.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes yes.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 9 ayes and 17 noes.
The amendment is not adopted.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Arizona.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman will, clerk will report the amendment. Gentleman from Georgia reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277.
Without objection, the
offered by-
amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized to, on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am offering this amendment to ensure that the bill captures the totality of agency actions. The American people elected us to legislate. In a time of record inflation and an executive branch that has grown out of control, it is well past time to regain control over the administrative state. Currently, agency rules must go through a full notice and comment process. But agency guidance is not subject to the same requirements. And my simple amendment fixes this loophole. It subjects guidance that has the same effect of the rules and makes it subject to the REINS Act. It would require that guidance be explicitly included in the definition of a rule under the Congressional Review Act and therefore subject to congressional oversight. It would also require that significant guidance without an economic impact of $100 million or more must go through a full notice and comment process to ensure it then goes into the congressional oversight process. Under the CRA, my amendment would include guidance in the agency reports to Congress and give us an opportunity to act to stop it. If the REINS Act becomes law, an agency won't be able to implement a major rule or guidance with this amendment without formal approval from the House and Senate. I support the underlying bill. It is an important step, and Representative Klein's bill, Ensuring Accountability in Agency Rulemaking Act, is another fine bill to reel in the unelected and unaccountable administrative state. Without this amendment, a clever drafter will circumvent the REINS Act, enacting an agenda through neither rulemaking nor congressional statute, as we've seen from this very administration. For instance, with President Biden's student loan cancellation, guidance was treated as binding and used to circumvent public input and avoid congressional oversight. And that had an impact of over $600 billion. Guidance allows bureaucrats to bypass Congress entirely. If we want to offer families, workers, or small business owners real relief, it's going to require a serious effort on our part to stop out-of-control bureaucrats from regulating and spending away our country's future. The agency guidance has been used too long as a bludgeon, a hammer, and it has been exploitable by the bureaucracy. If we're going to rein in the administrative state, this amendment is certainly the way we do it. If we're serious about reestablishing accountability and responsibility, then my colleagues should join me by passing this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Chairman, I'll withdraw the point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I'd move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
It is kind of astonishing, but here we go. This amendment would further hamstring the government from completing the tasks that Congress has assigned it to do. So now we're not just talking about actual regulations, we're talking about guidance, which doesn't even have the same authority. It's just incredible overreach by a body which is already struggling to perform its basic functions to now say that nothing else can happen unless Congress were to act. There's a different process here. There's the opportunity for public comment here. Congress certainly can take action if warranted to change a result. But just throwing one more roadblock in terms of the government being able to complete the tasks that Congress has already tasked it with, it just really goes to show, once again, that when you have folks who think that government is bad, you get bad government, and that's all this amendment would provide. So I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually think it's a very good amendment because it's even worse, the guidance is even worse, than everything else because it costs so much money. And think about agencies like FDA. They issue this guidance and reissue the guidance. It costs billions of dollars, of companies that are doing research. It creates unpredictability, and it costs taxpayers at the end because passed on to us as a consumer, but also it's stolen innovation. And this guidance has no clear rule how it's issued, no ability to input. It's terrible. The same happened in the Department of Energy with all of the different things, the guidance seems to do for different like nuclear plants. I mean, this stuff is so important, you know, for us to be able to have the predictable set of rules, and there's rules that express actually the will of Congress and the will of the people. So this is an amendment that actually probably make this bill even more important, because guidance, it's really something that agencies shouldn't even be able to do, but they put such enforcement mechanism on this guidance that it's actually cost so much for the economy, for the taxpayer, but also to people's lives in some industry, because sometimes it's life and death situation. And when we stall some of these innovative, you know, drugs that may save people's lives, we actually, you know, we might be able to not save some people. So this is a significantly important issue, and I appreciate the gentleman bringing this amendment. I hope this committee will support it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
I want to thank the congressman from Arizona for bringing what is an extremely important amendment to the REINS Act. I'm just going to give an example of how guidance is used by the federal regulatory agencies to circumvent the APA and the rights of the American public. In 2019, the USDA issued a two-page fact sheet that they posted to the USDA's website that required all livestock producers in the United States, all cattle and bison producers, to start using RFID, radio frequency identification ear tags, by January 1, 2023, or they would be prohibited from being able to sell their cattle across state lines. This obviously would have a huge impact on a state like Wyoming, which is a large cattle producer, but we don't have packing plants in the state of Wyoming, so all of our cattle is shipped out of state. This was a two-page fact sheet issued on a website without notice, no comment period. According to the USDA, the price tag of this requirement to the cattle and bison industries would have been $2 billion. That's how these administrative agencies use and abuse guidance, and it absolutely should be included within this bill, within the REINS Act. I again appreciate the inclusion of the word guidance. This is another area where Congress has got to oversee what these agencies are doing and prevent them from being able to abuse their power in the way that they have repeatedly in the past. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Question occurs on the gentleman from Arizona's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, on the assurance that this is going to be taken up in the Rules Committee, I will withdraw.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. Question. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized. You have an amendment?
Yes, thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Oh, okay, you have the
Is there a point of order?
So,
We're waiting on the amendment, and
thank you.
maybe we'll stand in recess while we get the amendment. Yeah, we're fine.
Children's. Yeah. Yeah.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277 offered by Ms. Scanlon of Pennsylvania.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized. The gentleman from Arizona has a point of order.
Thank you. So my amendment would make sure that federal agencies would, under this REINS Act, would still be able to issue rules to lower the incidence of childhood cancer, asthma, and premature mortality. 1 in 4 children in my region have childhood asthma, largely as a result of environmental factors. And that's why, among other things, the effort to repeal the truck emissions regulations that's occurring this week is so concerning, because that's one of the contributing factors. We also have really important research and treatment facilities, whether Children's Hospital or St. Christopher's Hospital, that provide research and data and innovative treatments to children in our region, but there's a lot going on in this region. We need the support of the federal regulators to be able to push that research forward to make sure that we're protecting the kids in our region. So, we hope our committee can agree here that it's important to protect kids from pollution, from dangerous products, to be able to push forward the promising new medications that they may be able to take. So, if we're going to gum up the rulemaking process with these burdensome procedural rules, can we at least make sure that we protect children's health? I'd yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Well, I'm not sure, I think I know what the amendment's trying to do. But was this something that was offered under a previous piece of legislation that may have been drafted in a way that would accomplish what the amendment tries to do right now? I'm not sure if my colleague had tried to tackle this issue last Congress when they were in control. I think it goes back to the bigger piece and the full bill, which is I've seen the REINS Act and I've seen it work. And the problem oftentimes can be that even the lawmaker, the legislator, really doesn't do the work up front. They don't draft the legislation in a way that could be clear and all-inclusive and kind of either lays a path for those agencies that may end up doing the rulemaking and being able to, and what the REINS Act would do is it allows you to put in place some type of scope statement that would actually then go back to the legislature so they could take a look at it and say, this does meet the legislative intent.
Would the gentleman yield?
This meets the legislative intent. And if everyone then is on the same page, fine, then move forward with the legislation and ultimately it may pass both houses and be signed into law. But, I don't think we look kind of in the mirror on some of this stuff, on some of these bills and say, did you do a good job when you drafted it in the first place?
Would the gentleman
and I think
yield?
that's part of this conversation, so.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
No, I won't yield. I think the other thing would be, you can have a fiscal trigger too, right? It may not apply to every piece of legislation that makes its way through the body, through either the House or the Senate. But that's the way it works in some states, and they've had great success. I think one of the things that's most troubling about what I've been hearing today is that there are a group, some elected officials, I've seen it before, who cozy up to the bureaucracy. They believe that the answers are all within the bureaucracy, so they cozy up to it. They say, without the bureaucracy, this will not work. And I think that's the opposite view that I take, and I hope that many other elected officials take, is that you should be a skeptic. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't good people in the bureaucracy and people with expertise and people that we rely on a regular basis when there's a very technical type of legislation, piece of legislation. But, to cozy up to them, that's not your job. That's not why you were elected, to become complicit with the bureaucracy. You're here to work with your colleagues to draft legislation and make sure that what you drafted is ultimately met with the same goals that the rulemaking is drawn up on. And if we don't have that second kick at the cat, if we don't have that second opportunity to kind of dig into this and say, does this meet kind of the goals that we ultimately set as a legislative body, I don't think we're doing our job. So with that, I think that, my colleague, well-intentioned, I think, in trying to somehow address a very specific issue that obviously would pull at the heartstrings of anybody, may be well-intentioned, but again, I think the overall goal here is to come up with a piece of legislation that holds the bureaucracy accountable. And that's why I think the REINS Act, it's working in states all over this nation. It works great. It really is. It's a piece of legislation that's been drafted and run through many state houses, and it works very well at that level. So that's why I think the bill's a good idea, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the amendment offered by my colleague from Pennsylvania. I'm proud of her for putting this together. I'm proud of her for taking a look at what we're talking about here, the absurdity of what this underlying bill would do and the harm it will cause to the health and safety of all Americans if we go through this ridiculous proposal by the other side around rulemaking, substituting our thoughts on any of these issues: clean air, clean water, safety of transportation, safety of flight, EPA regulations, and the like, and putting that within non-expert hands. We have experts who are doing cutting-edge research on all kinds of areas, and specific to this amendment, research on the health and safety of our children, the well-being of our children. So I rise in support of this. I don't understand how anybody could not support and be a yes on this amendment, offering an exception for the health and safety of our children. And with that, I yield to my colleague, the author of the amendment from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. And if the gentleman had been willing to yield, I wanted to express that, I understand his concern about legislation that is drafted without sufficient input when people aren't given the opportunity to help make a bill better, as we've been seeing repeatedly throughout this Congress, so that there are gaps in what is sent to the floor, what is sent to the agencies. But instead of trying to block agency action that might fill in some of these gaps appropriately, this bill would block agency action and force things back to Congress rather than forcing Congress to do the job right in the first time. So I share the congressman's concern about Congress legislating well in the first instance, but hamstringing the entire federal government when Congress is not doing its best work, I think punishes all of America, and I don't think that's the appropriate response. So I yield back to my colleague, Ms. Dean.
And I yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
The gentleladies from Pennsylvania yield back. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I put in kind of a few things. I have kept listening to this debate. First of all, I think it's absurdity to think that somehow the people that sit in these offices in Washington, D.C., that a lot of this agency that never had a job in the real world, they know better than the American people on the ground and actually doing the work. And the only input that the American people do have, that actually through us, through legislative branch. So this actually, our responsibility and duty to do that. And I think this bill doesn't do anything except it just says, we have a big overreach right now by administrative state. And we as in Congress needs to do our job. And maybe some people don't like it. Well, you know what? You don't have to run for office if you don't want to do your job. But if you ran for this office to represent these people, you should not be afraid to spend some time legislating, creating policies that represent the people. And to tell you the truth, sometimes actually it does disservice because regulations, it is a long process and goes through a lot of drama. If something is very good and something is really important for children or fight cancer or something, actually Congress has a good ability maybe to do it faster, because if we can agree and have consensus, we can put bills on suspension and pass so quickly if it's good for the people. So actually agencies and bureaucracy are stalling a lot of innovation that would be so good for the Americans. And that is the biggest problem we are facing right now, is expensive. A lot of people cannot even bring innovation because you have to hire so many so-called attorneys and PhD and experts that charge a bunch of fees that a lot of them have no idea what's going on in the real world. But if you don't have a lot of money to bring your innovation or invention, if you're not able to do it, if you're a startup company, you have no ability to do it. That's why only big companies now getting bigger. And we have, we're always fighting too large to fail. Our too large to fail is even bigger now. Like in every industry, we're getting such oligopolies everywhere that we're going to be in trouble soon because they have controlled so much of the market. So I think it's actually very positive would be for us and for innovation and for children and fight a lot of diseases and everything if Congress would do a job and actually does some of this, promulgate this legislation correctly, plus probably more on a narrow basis. We shouldn't give so much, power and broad authority to the other branch. We have to think what our laws are doing. We have to spend time things how they implement and adjusting them. That is part of effective legislative process. We also need to think what federal government should be doing and what states and locals should be doing, because unfortunately, federal government somehow thinks we're so superior here to everyone else. We're accumulating so much power that our core functions, the protecting constitutional rights, securing our border, having strong military and national defense, we're not doing the greatest job on that because we're stretched to things. We're doing a lot of things that states are closer to the people and would be much more effective doing that. And I think Congress maybe start thinking, oh my gosh, I have to vote on all these things. Maybe that is not a job that we should be even doing here. And we're overreaching what we're doing as a branch. And I think that will make us think twice in the legislators here. So I think it's a very good legislation. It's unfortunate that we cannot come to bipartisan consensus. And we should be able to oversee the other branch regardless who's in charge, Democrat or Republican. It should not matter. We are co-equal branch of government, and actually probably the most powerful from co-equal, because we have power of the person, power of the war, and founding fathers wanted us to be like that. So when we are not doing our job, we're doing disservice to this republic and to the American people, and I think we need to think about that. So all this bill does, it tells Congress, don't subrogate your powers, do your job, legislate for people, and let the American people have an input. It doesn't matter, because this is a country that it doesn't matter where you're born, rich or poor, where you came from, it doesn't matter. Your rights are equally protected. And constitutional republic is very important, where you don't have a tyranny of majority, but you have ability to protect rights of a minority. And that is the most important function we have. But if we allow other branch to legislate on our behalf and promulgate laws on our behalf and decide about people's rights, we are betraying our republic and our constitutional values. So hopefully we could have a consensus. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman, let's go first to Mr. Gentleman from Arizona, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So,
I need you first to withdraw your point of order.
Oh, yes, I withdraw the point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, there's been an allusion that the REINS Act will be hamstringing the federal government. So I think the problem here is fundamentally, again, it gets to, again, the distinction of the worldview. But overall, the Democrats' point of view seems to be that administrative agencies under a REINS Act application will not promulgate any rules and not be able to promulgate any rules. Even ones like are being offered in this amendment that are viewed as being righteous and important. And so they're worried that if the REINS Act goes into effect, you just won't have any administrative rules. They're not, but that's simply not the case. The reality is administrative agencies will continue to promulgate rules. The only thing being that certain of those rules are going to be brought back before the legislative body for approval. That is to say, the people's representatives will have the final say on specific, certain rules promulgated by agencies. And so you don't need to do special exemptions and carve-outs, because if that rule has an impact defined by the REINS Act, it will come here. And this notion that somehow we are incapable of listening to input from the agency or those upon whom the agency relied as they promulgated a proposed rule just doesn't seem to wash. So for me, this amendment is superfluous, it's not necessary, and it gets to this crazy presumption, the premise that the Democrats have, which is unfortunate because it wasn't too many years ago that this was a bipartisan issue and passed out of here, bipartisanship. And with that, I'll yield to the gentleman from New Jersey if he wants some time.
Thank you, my friend. Very quickly, I'll tell you what the purpose of this amendment is, and I don't mean to be mean-spirited. The purpose of the amendment is to make Republicans look bad. The purpose of the amendment is to literally say that we don't care about little sick children and that we don't care about their health. That's an absurd notion. All this bill requires is Congress to affirmatively approve major rules. If there's a good major rule that's going to help sick children and it's done appropriately, we're obviously going to approve it. No more, no less. But we want to make sure that it's done right. No Congress, no Republican congressman is going to say we're against helping sick babies. Come on. Let's be real. And I would encourage my colleagues not to vote for this. I yield back.
And I'll yield back to the
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief. The purpose of this amendment is not to make Republicans look bad. The entire bill makes Republicans look bad, terrible, in fact, because the entire bill would eliminate the ability to protect the air and the water and the safety of airplanes and the safety of cars, the safety of trains, and everything else. This bill would endanger every citizen every person living in the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Wow. So this is great. Thank you for the setup, Mr. Ranking Member. To have Congress make the laws to protect us from calamity would be a catastrophe for the American people. And look, there are a lot of people out there that say the way Congress operates, that seems to be true because Congress is frustrating. It's meant to be frustrating in its design. But remember what Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government ever conceived except for all of the others. I'll offer my own suggestion about the purpose of the amendment. The purpose of the amendment, the issue has already been vetted in the last amendment. But I guess the Democrats are offering a series of amendments to pick out things that they would say, they want you to take a specific example and say, with this, wouldn't you want the agency to be able to act? Well, and here's the problem with that. It is affected by careless, utopian thinking. Let me tell you why. I'll bet nobody's actually read the language of the proposed amendment and thought about what it covers. It is the gas stove ban exemption. It's the gas stove ban exemption. Let me read the part I'm talking about, because somebody mentioned childhood cancer. Okay, here's the language. I'm going to read the whole effective language. The term special rule, so these would be, a special rule would be exempted from the purview of Congress. It means any rule promulgated that would result, think about those words a minute, would result in children experiencing a reduced incidence, think about that one too, of cancer, premature mortality, very bad things, asthma attacks, or respiratory disease. What have we heard of late by those who want to ban gas stoves? Well, they say that the air in houses with gas stoves is dangerous or is harmful in some way. It just happens to be the case that the same people are among the same supporters are the lunatics who want to completely eradicate fossil fuel use. That might be motivating them, but they don't want to admit it. So the rule you want to admit, or a rule you want to exempt from Congress looking at it, you would want the technicians and the experts, because we definitely need to defer to them, who say that gas stoves have been in use in American households for a century or two, a century at least, need to be eliminated because they might have some ameliorative effect, reduce the incidence of asthma attacks or respiratory disease in some small group of people at some point in time. Look, if it's true that will happen, the experts can walk right up here, sit at just those tables in the right committee, and tell Congress we have a magical answer to asthma and respiratory disease. Just ban gas stoves from Americans' homes. And Congress could say, oh my, why haven't we thought of that? That's a great idea. Americans will be delighted to have their gas stoves ripped out of their homes because of the fear of an asthma attack for little Johnny. Or Congress could say, thank you for your advice. We believe that you are insane. And the American people would throw us out of office if we banned their gas stoves from their homes. That could be another one. So the bill contains categorical carve-outs. It allows the President of the United States for a single, if there's an emergency, if somebody comes out with the cure to childhood cancer, if a bureaucrat just by the stroke of a pen can cure childhood cancer, wipe it out because of some 150 words in a reg, the President of the United States could issue an order for 90 days, because we can't wait for that. 90 days. And in 90 days, certainly all childhood cancer would be cured, and at that point, what Congress ever would not adopt that as into law? I think Congress would. This is silliness. I'm listening to the most acerbic terms from the minority, that we would ask Congress to make our laws. from the architects of the preservation of our democracy. Wow. Good luck to our democracy. My time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And after serving in our state legislature in Florida, now here in the Congress, I've come to learn that the more I see of government, the less of it I want. And that seems to be the reaction increasingly of our constituents who face woke and weaponized agencies with seemingly unlimited authority to be able to impact regulatory costs. And I've heard the minority debate against the underlying REINS Act and for these various carve-outs in terms that would scare people. We wouldn't be able to make decisions. Our process would be frozen. Chaos would ensue. I'm here to tell you we have test cases that empirically prove that to be false. The very first piece of legislation I passed in the state legislature was the Florida version of the REINS Act that said that if regulatory costs were at a certain level, the agency could be compelled to produce a lower cost regulatory alternative. And they would have to defend that, and if they could not, then that particular regulatory action would not have the force of law. And all of the things that my colleagues in the minority have been saying did not happen. Why? Because if agencies have to defend their conduct, there is a deterrent effect against inappropriate agency action. In the Florida legislature, we actually meet a lot less than here in the United States Congress. And they haven't had to review hundreds or thousands of these regulations that exceed the authority. In those circumstances, the legislature, I think, has put the right constraint on the administrative state so that everyone could stay in their lanes. And so if the animation does not come from a sincere desire to save us from chaos, then why would the minority in this case not want the politically elected representatives of the people to be the lawmakers? And I think the real reason is that they want to divorce the painful decisions that bureaucrats make from political accountability. Because regular folks don't get to go vote against somebody with green eye shades and a windowless cubicle at the IRS building. They vote for or against their representatives in a republic. And so that's what this is really all about, being able to ensure that where people feel pain in terms of complying with laws, so these are the people who want to comply and feel an economic pain as a consequence, and where the agency cannot produce a lower cost regulatory alternative, we think the obligation should be on the Congress. And that is, I think, the better representation of good governance. That's certainly been our experience in Florida. And if there is a state that has done what mine has and has adopted a state-level version of this to constrain their state government, and it has resulted in the hysteria that we hear from the minority, I look forward to hearing that case study. Seeing none of my colleagues that seek further time, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call being requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Spartz? Ms. Spartz votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivey? Mr. McClintock votes no.
All members voted. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 15 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for an amendment.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment.
Point of order reserved by the gentleman from Florida.
To H.R. 277 offered by
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you. Once more into the breach. Like the other amendments my colleagues have offered today, this amendment would exempt the Food and Drug Administration from the REINS Act so the knowledgeable career public services servants at the FDA can continue their work to keep our food and medicine safe. I'm curious who amongst my colleagues wants to venture that they know enough about food safety or chemistry to opine on what drugs should be approved or what food can be sold at our supermarkets. I'm not sure that a bunch of lawyers or politicians are the right people to be making the granular decisions about those products. And I bet the majority of Americans would agree that these decisions should be made by people with actual expertise and not politicians. And with that, I'd yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Florida withdraws his point of order. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just argue, as we have against all these other amendments, that this in no way inhibits the ability of these regulators to make recommendations about the safety of our food or the safety of our water, but ultimately leaves the decision to the representatives of the people. And I would argue that restoring Article 1 authority is something that our constituents would support. Having a greater say in the way that their bureaucracy operates is something that we should strive for. So I would urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Question, the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief. I will simply reassert what we've said on some of the other amendments and what Ms. Scanlon has said. We're talking here about the Food and Drug Administration. It does not, the Congress does not have the expertise to decide which foods are safe, what additives to food are safe, what drugs are safe. We delegate that to an agency with expertise that can actually make such judgments. If we disagree with them, we have the CRA, and that's why I support the amendment, and I will oppose the bill.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I oppose this amendment. Congress is capable of considering and approving agency rules. We're not saying the agencies can't have a say in it. The FDA can make a recommendation, but ultimately we are accountable to the people. Let me give you an example of something the FDA has just done recently. This will kick in 2 weeks. If you go to your farm supply store, it now says over-the-counter livestock antibiotics will require veterinary prescription starting June 11th, 2023. That was an FDA edict. They just came up with it on their own. For as long as antibiotics have existed, farmers could go buy antibiotics at the farm supply store. The FDA has now just put this huge regulation on small farmers. It's going to be, and a lot of people don't realize the FDA has anything to do with day-to-day farm management, but they do. What this will do is it's another one of those examples of scale prejudicial regulation. Every giant corporate farm has got a veterinarian right there on staff. But most small farmers, you call a veterinarian, you can't get one to come out. They are overworked, and there aren't enough of them. And so this is an example. This is a prime example of a regulation that the FDA put in place when they came out and just unilaterally said on June 11th, 2023, if you're a farmer, you can't treat your own animals with an antibiotic. And it's not just about antibiotics. They call them antimicrobials. So they're going to expand this eventually to just about anything you need. Now, here's what's going to happen. Animals will go untreated for diseases. Is this going to make us safer? To make it harder to treat your own animals for disease? No, but the FDA promulgated this rule, and the FDA is the one responsible for it, although I would argue under our system of government, we should be responsible for it. That's what the overall bill, the REINS Act, does. And if you exempt the FDA from the REINS Act, this is the kind of nonsense you're going to get. Is there anybody here? Would anybody here say we shouldn't vote on whether farmers can get antibiotics or not? Is our whole body, the 435 of us, so stupid that we can't go get the information? We can't go talk to our farmers? We can't go talk to our veterinarians? We can't go talk to people in our district and find out whether this is a good rule or not?
Does the gentleman want a response?
I would love a response. Do you think Congress should be able to say whether farmers are able to treat their animals or not?
Well, I think certainly that Congress can do that, but when Congress can't even raise the debt ceiling to pay the country's bills, I think there's a lack of capacity.
Reclaiming my time, I voted to raise the debt ceiling, and the gentlelady hasn't, as far as I can tell, this Congress. So, and if we can be responsible for something like the debt limit on our side of the aisle, then we can decide, and we should decide, whether farmers have access to common drugs to treat their animals in order to prevent the spread of disease. This is crazy, but this is one of those FDA rules that's kicking in on June 11th, 2023. It's an example of why we need the REINS Act, and it's an example of why this is a bad amendment. I urge a no vote on the amendment and a yes vote on the REINS Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Request, no? Okay.
Question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of the substitute will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Question now occurs, reporting quorum being present. The question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered. Reported. Gentleman from New York request a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll on the final passage.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Isa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Spartz? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes yes. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Bishop, you are not recorded. Mr. Bishop votes aye.
Any members who wish to vote who haven't, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 13 ayes and 5 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 357, the Ensuring Accountability and Agency Rulemaking Act, for the purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the resolution.
H.R. 357 to require the head of an agency.
Without objection, the resolution will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Excuse me, the bill will be reported as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. This is in keeping with today's theme of reining in excessive executive branch bureaucracy and restoring accountability to the Article 2 branch. Our framers understood that to ensure an effective government, the executive branch should be armed with the constitutional duty to execute the laws, but not to make the laws. So these powers over the course of time have been abused and expanded through the appointments clause of the Constitution. All agency heads and principal officers are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Inferior officers must undergo the same appointment process unless Congress by law has said otherwise. And the court has consistently agreed that rulemaking is a significant government power that may be exercised only by officers appointed in accordance with the Constitution's appointments clause. Buckley v. Vallejo in the Supreme Court decided supported the conclusion that only principal agency officers, like department heads and assistant secretaries confirmed by the Senate, may issue regulations that have the force of law and cannot be amended without any other rulemaking procedure. But compliance with constitutional rulemaking requirements has been inconsistent. This undermines accountability and opens agencies up to legal challenges because of improperly issued rules, which also provides uncertainty for individuals and business owners, and for those on the other side who like the issuance of so many rules, to insert doubt into that process is something they should be concerned with as well. According to a 2017 study by the Pacific Legal Foundation, the Department of Health and Human Services rulemaking practices over the last 20 years revealed that of 3,000 rules issued by the agency, approximately 77% were unconstitutionally issued without principal agency officer approval. Of FDA administration final rules, 98% were invalid. So this legislation would require that all rules be signed and issued by an individual appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. It's a bipartisan legislation supported by members of both parties. Agency rules have the power of law, so it makes sense that the legislative branch has some say in who's behind them, and I urge support for the legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Ensuring Accountability in Agency Rulemaking Act is a misguided proposal that would ensure that the process of confirming nominees to administrative agencies is even more politicized and onerous than it is today, while also blocking the regular work of our executive branch agencies. This bill would require any agency rule made under the Administrative Procedure Act to be issued and signed by someone who is appointed to their position by the President, and confirmed by the Senate. This requirement on its face may seem innocuous, but it provides Congress with the weapon it can wield to prevent the ongoing work of agencies by blocking a president's nominations and leaving an agency without an eligible person to issue regulations. In the past few decades, the process for Senate confirmation has lengthened considerably. Although we have passed measures like the Federal Vacancies Reform Act to ease this burden, there are still over 1,000 executive branch roles that require Senate confirmation, and far too many go unfilled for years at a time as it is. By requiring that rulemaking must be initiated and signed by a Senate-confirmed leader, this bill would add more politicization to the confirmation process and could give individual senators more incentive to block nominations for the sake of a partisan goal. This would add unnecessary delay in the creation, promulgation, and implementation of critical new rules, rules that serve to protect the public's health, safety, and security. The bill's sloppy drafting also adds ambiguity to the process. For example, the bill requires that any rule must be initiated by a senior appointee. But what action qualifies as initiating a rule? Is it when it is first posited in a meeting at the agency? Is it when staff start drafting a notice of proposed rulemaking? Is it when a proposed rule is put out for notice and comment? Is it something in between? We do not know. Instead of creating another obstacle to agency rulemaking, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting constructive measures like the Stop Corporate Capture Act by Representative Jayapal, which would make agencies more accountable to the public and not just give the Senate another reason to delay a nominee or even to allow a nomination to lapse. I urge members to join me in opposing this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 357, offered by Mr. Klein of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment adds the commonly used acronyms OIRA for Office of Information Regulatory Affairs and OMB for Office of Management and Budget in defining the term administrator. Changes clarify the meaning of the bill and make it more easily understood. They're not intended in any way to alter the important purpose of this bill. I urge my support for my amendment, and I yield back.
Without objection, the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, for purposes of a unanimous consent request.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from the American Federation of Government Employees and a letter from the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards be admitted into the record.
Without objection. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Gentleman from Louisiana reserves point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 357 offered by Ms. Scanlon.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Just like the REINS Act, which we just completed consideration on, this bill is another disguised attempt to gum up the rulemaking process for the entire federal government. This does nothing to provide more congressional oversight over the rulemaking process. It just creates another bottleneck that our colleagues across the aisle can take advantage of to stop rules they don't like. My amendment is a straightforward fix to undo the harms this bill would create. The addition I'm proposing would allow interim heads of executive branch agencies to approve final rules, so long as the president has nominated a successor. And I view this as a really necessary improvement to this bill because we have all too recently seen what happens when the Senate employs disingenuous tactics to refuse to confirm a duly nominated appointee by the President of the United States. So this is a common sense policy to ensure that politics doesn't jam up the ability of our federal agencies to function properly, even if the Senate cannot. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I withdraw the point of order. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Klein's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment. The amendment really defeats the purpose of the bill, which is to restore some accountability to the people in the issuance of these regulations by ensuring that someone appointed by the president on an interim basis and not confirmed by the Senate can sign off on regulations. You're really not changing the status quo, and I think we would all agree that the status quo is broken when it comes to the actions of our bureaucracy and the issuance of these thousands of pages of regulations each year. So I would urge my colleagues to defeat the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment by the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Clerk.
Aye.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
All opposed? No. Independent chair, the noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan, Mr. Issa, Mr. Buck, Mr. Gates, Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany, Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy, Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Spartz, Mr. Fitzgerald, Mr. Bentz, Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden, Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman, Mr. Moran, Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt, Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff, Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Swalwell, Mr. Liu, Ms. Jayapal, Mr. Correa, Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse, Ms. McBath, Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar, Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa, you're not recorded. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Schiff, you're not recorded. Mr. Schiff votes aye. Ms. Spartz, you're not recorded. Ms. Spartz votes no. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Chairman, there are 8 ayes and 17 noes.
Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor will say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The question now occurs on final passage of the bill as amended. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote being requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden?
You
Mr. Van Drew?
You did it right.
Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes yes. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes yes.
Okay, then I'll keep.
Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes yes. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Ivy?
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 9 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1505, the No Stolen Trademarks Honored in America Act of 2023 for purposes of a markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1505 to modify the prohibition on recognition by United States courts of certain rights relating to certain marks.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In bringing H.R. 1504, the No Stolen Trademarks Honored in America Act, for consideration, the fact is that I want to first of all thank Representative Wasserman Schultz for being the principal co-sponsor on this. The fact is the legislation is intended to right wrongs dating all the way back to the communist takeover of Cuba. The reality is this legislation would prohibit executive agencies from recognizing, enforcing, or otherwise validating any assertion of rights by an individual or a trademark that was used in connection with a business or assets that were confiscated by the Cuban regime, unless original owner of the trademark expressly consented to the transfer of the mark. As we sit here today, there were many famous marks that were seized. The Coca-Cola facility in Cuba was seized, and yet Coca-Cola retains its mark everywhere in the world except, of course, in Cuba. This legislation, in righting the wrong in one circumstance in particular, it corrects a historic wrong and clearly has been acknowledged by anyone who inherently understands the value of intellectual property and the ownership thereof. The legislation makes technical corrections to our law, but one that ensures that protections of our laws apply to all parties claiming U.S. rights to confiscated Cuban trademarks, regardless of their nationality. H.R. 1505 protects U.S. trademarks and their legitimate owners from the effects of confiscation by Cuba or by the Cuban government, and upholds firmly established principles in our law and public policy that foreign confiscation measures must never be given an effect of property transfer here in the United States. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Natter, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1505, the No Stolen Trademarks Honored in America Act, involves a long-running dispute over the rightful ownership of one specific trademark, Havana Club Rum. It is a case with more twists and turns than a John Grisham novel. But this bill also stands for an important principle, that we stand with the Cuban people whose property was seized by the Castro regime, and we will not give the protection and benefits of the U.S. trademark system to the holders of stolen property. The Havana Club case begins with the Arechabala family, who began making rum in Cuba under the name Havana Club in 1934, and who secured a trademark from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. On New Year's Day, 1960, not long after Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba, soldiers arrived at the Havana Club office and seized the company by force, and the family was forced to flee to the United States. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the Arechabalas failed to renew their trademark for Havana Club when it expired in 1973, enabling a state-owned Cuban company called Cuba Export, which had been selling rum internationally under the name Havana Club, to swoop in a few years later and to obtain the trademark registration for itself. Although by that time the U.S. had imposed an economic embargo on Cuba, the trademark registration could be held in case one day the embargo was lifted. The story only gets more complicated, however. In 1993, Cuba Export entered into a joint venture with a French company, Pernod Ricard, to become equal partners in their version of Havana Club, while a year later, the liquor company Bacardi paid the Arechabala family for their secret recipe and for whatever rights they retained in the original Havana Club. Bacardi began selling its product in the United States, filing for its own trademark in 1994. These dueling trademarks sparked nearly 2 decades of litigation that continues to this day in various forms. But the story does not end there. In 1998, in the midst of the legal battle over Havana Club, Congress included a provision in that year's Omnibus Appropriations Bill. Section 211, as it is known, prohibits U.S. courts from recognizing, enforcing, or otherwise validating any assertion of rights by a Cuban national of trademarks used in connection with any business that was confiscated by the Cuban government. This provision placed the U.S. firmly on record in support of the rightful owners of stolen property and against the use of its trademark system to protect the holders of confiscated assets. Unfortunately, the World Trade Organization later determined that Section 211 runs afoul of certain international obligations because it treats Cuban nationals differently from those of other countries. The U.S. remains in noncompliance with the WTO's ruling today, although Section 211 continues to be valid law in the United States. There is one final wrinkle to the story. In 2006, Cuba Export and its joint venture sought to renew its trademark registration in Havana Club. But because of the U.S. embargo against Cuba, it was not able to obtain the required license from the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which would have permitted it to pay the renewal fee. The application remained pending until 2016, when, following the Obama administration's easing of economic restrictions against Cuba, OFAC reversed course and approved the license to pay the renewal fee. At that point, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office determined that by law, it was required to renew Cuba Export's trademark registration. This finally brings us to the legislation before us today. H.R. 1505 would expand the application of Section 211 to the executive branch, such that in addition to prohibiting enforcement in the courts of a mark associated with confiscated Cuban assets, it would also prohibit any entity of the executive branch from doing so. This would have the effect of preventing the USPTO from renewing Cuba Export's trademark registration when it next expires in 2026, thereby ensuring that the United States protects the rights and interests of entrepreneurs whose assets were confiscated by the Cuban regime unless clear consent was granted by the trademark's original owner. The bill would also remedy the WTO ruling against Section 211 by removing the limitation that it applies only to Cuban nationals. Mr. Chairman, the Havana Club dispute makes for a fascinating tale, to be sure, but this legislation is really about a larger principle. Our trademark system must not be allowed to be a vehicle for the perpetrators of stolen property to profit from their theft. I want to thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, and the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, for bringing this legislation forward, and I urge all members to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1505, offered by Mr. Issa of California. Strike all after the enacting.
Without objection, the amendment is in the nature of a substitute. We consider as read and shall be considered as base text for the purpose of amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to explain the amendment.
Chairman, I'll be brief. This is simply technical and conforming changes and no other substantive change in the bill. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor, aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. We have 4 technical correction bills to be considered. Without objection, the committee will consider these 4 bills in block. Hearing none and pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3571, H.R. 3506, H.R. 3496, and H.R. 3578 for purpose of markup, and move that the committee report these bills favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bills.
H.R. 3571, H.R. 3506, H.R. 3496, H.R. 3578.
Without objection, the bills will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. These 4 bills were submitted to the committee by the Office of Law Revision Counsel. The OLRC is a small office in the House of Representatives that is responsible for preparing and publishing the United States Code. As Congress passes laws, the code needs to be updated to incorporate these new laws and to ensure that references are correct. Providing for the maintenance of the code is the responsibility of the Judiciary Committee, and we work with the OLRC to accomplish that fundamental task. The bills before us today make technical corrections to update internal references throughout the code. These updates are necessary to help Americans understand what our code says. They do not change the meaning. It's important they do not change the meaning or affect any law on the books today. Our committee has historically dealt with these bills in a bipartisan manner, and that will continue this Congress. I want to thank Ms. Hageman, Mr. Kiley, Ms. Dean, and Mr. Ivey for introducing these 4 bills before us today. I urge all members to support the bills. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one of the important responsibilities the House gives this committee is to oversee the revision and codification of the statutes of the United States. Keeping track of the new laws Congress passes every session is a formidable challenge, but it is an essential part of maintaining the rule of law in our country, and it is a duty we take seriously on this committee. The body of federal law is so large and complex at this point that it would be almost completely unmanageable without the United States Code. Currently consisting of 54 titles, the code compiles the general and permanent laws of the United States into coherent subject areas. This makes our federal laws accessible both to the government officials who work to fairly administer them and to the private citizens who seek the benefits or relief the laws provide them. The painstaking and vital work of maintaining and updating the code falls to the expert lawyers working under the supervision of the House in the Office of Law Revision Counsel. We owe a great debt to these attorneys who ably carry out their statutory mandate to develop and keep, quote, to develop and keep current and official and positive codification of the laws of the United States, close quote, while maintaining strict impartiality as to legislative policy. Today, we are taking up 4 editorial reclassification bills that make conforming changes to statutes that have been impacted by the Office of Law Revision Counsel's reorganization efforts while making no change to the meaning or effect of any existing laws. I want to thank the chairman for the bipartisan way in which he is taking up these bills, and I want to thank the sponsors of each bill for their leadership on the important work of this committee. This legislation will help ensure that the code is an authoritative, accurate, and accessible source of federal law, and I urge all members to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. H.R. 3506 makes technical amendments to update statutory references to provisions in Title VII, Title 20, and Title 43 of the U.S. Code. In the process of updating statutory references, related technical errors were found, so the bill also makes amendments to correct those errors. As the Chair and Ranking Member explained, these changes came at the request of the Office of Law Revision Counsel. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Ranking Member Nadler for holding this markup. I'd like to take just a very brief moment to explain for folks watching at home what we're doing here with this block of bills. Some may be surprised to learn that Congress does in fact pass laws. We pass dozens of laws every session on topics ranging from international treaties to consumer safety standards. Some laws are brand new, others revise existing statutes. Congress has been doing its job for more than 2 centuries. In that time, federal law has grown quite complex. So another one of our responsibilities is to make sure that the laws we have enacted coherently operate with one another and that the U.S. Code makes literal sense. That job is what we're doing here today with these 4 editorial reclassification bills. One of those is a bill I have offered, H.R. 3571. These bills make technical changes like ensuring references between statutes are accurate, that laws are located in the correct section of the code, and that the punctuation makes sense. It is heartening to see that we continue to do this important work, Mr. Chairman, in a bipartisan manner. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs. Reporting quorum being present, sorry. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on favorably reporting the 4 bills. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bills are ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes the committee's business for the meeting. The meeting is adjourned.